Story 1. The Woman in the Fog. Marcus Webb had been hunting these mountains for 37 years, ever since his grandfather first took him out at age 12 with a worn .30 rifle and a stern warning about respecting what lived in these hills. Now 52, with silver streaking through his beard and a permanent limp from a logging accident in '98, Marcus knew every hollow and ridge of the Nantahala forest like the lines on his weathered hands. He'd seen black bears up close, stumbled upon illegal moonshine operations, and once tracked a wounded buck for 3 days through terrain that would break a younger man's spirit. Nothing in these ancient mountains surprised him anymore, or so he believed until that October morning when the fog rolled in thick as cotton batting. It was the 3rd week of bow season, and Marcus had positioned himself in a tree stand overlooking a game trail near Panther Creek, a narrow waterway that snaked through a valley so deep the sun barely touched the forest floor even at noon. He'd arrived at 4:30 in the morning, an hour before legal shooting time, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who could navigate these woods blindfolded. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees, cold enough to see his breath but not uncomfortable in his layers of wool and fleece. By 6 o'clock, as dawn broke pale and hesitant through the canopy, he'd already seen 2 does and a spike buck, none worth taking. That's when the fog came. It didn't drift in gradually like normal mountain fog. It appeared suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, rolling up from the creek bottom in thick, gray-white billows that swallowed the forest whole within minutes. Marcus had witnessed morning fog countless times, but this was different. It moved wrong, flowing uphill when it should have settled in the valleys, and it carried a smell he couldn't quite place, something organic and old, like the inside of a root cellar that hadn't been opened in decades. The fog grew so dense he could barely see 15 feet in any direction. The forest fell silent. No birds, no squirrels rustling through leaves, no distant crows calling to each other. Just oppressive, cotton-thick silence that pressed against his eardrums. Marcus checked his watch, 6:45. He decided to wait it out. Mountain fog usually burned off by mid-morning. That's when he saw her. She appeared at the edge of his visibility, standing perfectly still on the game trail below. A woman in a long dress that might have been white once but looked gray in the fog, her hair hanging loose and dark past her shoulders. Her feet. Marcus's first thought was that someone was lost, maybe a hiker separated from a group, though it seemed impossible anyone would be out here dressed like that, especially in this cold. "Ma'am," he called down, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. "You all right? You need help?" She didn't respond. Didn't move, just stood there facing away from him, her stillness absolute in a way that made Marcus's skin prickle. He'd seen deer freeze when they sensed danger, that preternatural motionlessness that seemed to defy even breathing, but this was different. This was a human being standing stock still in the middle of nowhere, in bare feet and a thin dress, in 40-degree weather, in fog so thick you could lose your hand in front of your face. "Ma'am, I'm coming down," Marcus said, already unclipping his safety harness. Something was wrong here. This woman needed help, whether she knew it or not. He descended the ladder steps as quietly as possible, his bow still strapped to his back, and when his boots touched the forest floor, he moved toward where she'd been standing. She was gone. Marcus stopped, his heart rate picking up. The trail was empty. He'd had his eyes on that spot for maybe 10 seconds while climbing down, and she'd vanished. He walked to the exact place where she'd stood, looking for footprints in the soft earth. Nothing. The trail showed deer tracks, his own boot prints from earlier, but no bare feet, no indication anyone had stood there at all. "Hello," he called, louder now, his voice muffled by the fog. "Where'd you go?" A sound reached him from deeper in the woods off the trail. Singing. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing something he didn't recognize. The melody was old, the kind of tune his grandmother might have hummed while canning vegetables, but the words were wrong in a language that sounded almost like English but wasn't quite. The cadence was off, the pronunciation strange. Marcus hesitated. Every instinct told him to climb back up his tree stand and wait this out, but concern overrode caution. If this woman was in trouble, suffering from exposure or disorientation, he couldn't just leave her out here. He stepped off the trail, moving toward the singing. The fog seemed to thicken as he walked, swirling around him in patterns that defied wind or logic. The singing continued, always seeming to come from just ahead, just out of sight. Marcus pushed through mountain laurel and rhododendron, the branches wet with condensation, soaking through his jacket. His GPS watch showed he'd traveled maybe 100 yards from the trail, but the terrain felt wrong. He knew this area. There shouldn't be this much here. The singing stopped abruptly. Marcus froze, listening. The silence pressed in again, absolute and suffocating. Then he heard it, footsteps moving through leaves, circling around behind him. He turned, and there she was again, maybe 20 feet away, still facing away from him. How had she gotten behind him without him hearing until now? "Ma'am, I don't know what's going on, but you need to," she turned. Marcus's words died in his throat. Her face was wrong. Not disfigured or monstrous in an obvious way, but wrong in the way a photograph looks when the proportions are slightly off. Her eyes sat too far apart, her mouth was too wide, and when she smiled, her teeth went back too far, row after row like a shark's mouth. But it was her eyes that made Marcus's blood turn to ice water. They were completely white, no iris, no pupil, just blank white orbs that somehow still conveyed she was looking directly at him. She started walking toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an amateur puppeteer. Her feet didn't make the sounds they should have in the leaves. Marcus backed up, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife on his belt because his bow was useless at this range. "Stay back," he managed, his voice cracking. She opened her mouth impossibly wide, and the singing started again, but this time it was coming from her throat while her mouth formed shapes that didn't match the sounds. The melody wrapped around him, making his head swim, and the fog pressed closer, darker now, tinged with something that might have been green or might have been his vision failing. Marcus ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the singing continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, echoing through the fog in ways that made no sense. He pulled out his GPS, trying to navigate back to the trail, but the screen showed coordinates that couldn't be right. According to the device, he was 3 miles from where he'd been hunting, in a completely different watershed. The ground beneath his feet changed, becoming rocky and uneven. He stumbled, caught himself against a tree trunk, and realized with growing horror that he didn't recognize anything around him. The trees were different, twisted and ancient, their bark hanging in sheets like peeling skin. Some of them had marks carved into them, symbols that might have been letters in a language he'd never seen. The fog thinned slightly, and Marcus found himself at the edge of a clearing he knew didn't exist on any map. In the center stood the foundation structure, stone chimney still standing. The rest collapsed into a pile of rotted timber and rusted metal. Surrounding it were markers, not proper headstones, but rough stones with names scratched into them. Dates from the 1700s and 1800s, some earlier. The woman stood in the clearing next to the chimney. She wasn't alone anymore. There were others now, 6 or 7 figures in similar old-fashioned clothing, all standing motionless, all facing him. None of them were quite right. One man's head tilted at an angle that should have broken his neck. A child's arms hung too long, knuckles nearly dragging the ground. They all had those same white, blank eyes. Marcus backed away slowly, not taking his eyes off them. They didn't pursue, just watched him retreat with those terrible eyes. When the fog swallowed them from view, he turned and ran again, not caring about direction anymore, just moving away from that awful clearing and those things that wore human shapes but weren't human at all. He ran for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, until he burst through a line of trees and stumbled onto a gravel road. A Forest Service road he recognized, one that ran about 2 miles from where he'd parked his truck. The fog was gone. The sun shone through the trees, normal and warm. Birds sang. A squirrel chattered at him from a nearby oak. Marcus stood on that road, hands on his knees, gasping for air, and checked his GPS. The coordinates made sense now. He was exactly where the road should be, about 1.5 miles from his truck in a straight line. He started walking, his legs shaking, glancing back over his shoulder every few seconds. He never found his tree stand again. Went back 3 days later with his son and a local game warden, followed his GPS coordinates to the exact spot, but there was nothing there. The trail he remembered was gone. The trees were different. It was like that whole section of forest had rearranged itself. Marcus still hunts, but never in that part of the Nantahala. He's heard the stories now, the old ones his grandfather never told him. About the settlements that disappeared in the 1700s, whole communities that vanished overnight with no trace except some foundations and unmarked graves. About the fog that comes when it shouldn't, and the things that walk in it wearing shapes they learned from watching humans but never quite getting the details right. He's heard the theory that some hollows in these mountains sit different, that they're older than the rock around them, that they remember things from before people came here and resent the intrusion. That the fog show you they're still there, still watching, still waiting. Marcus doesn't know if any of that's true. All he knows is what he saw, and that sometimes late at night when the fog rolls through the valley where he lives, he can hear singing in the distance. Old songs in languages that aren't quite English, melodies that make his chest ache with a homesickness for places he's never been. And he keeps his doors locked and his lights on until morning. Story 2. The Thing in the Mine. Raymond Cole had worked underground for 23 years before he saw something that made him quit the coal industry forever. He started at 19, following his father and grandfather into the mines of Harlan County, Kentucky, where the Coal Creek seam had been producing anthracite since 1902. By 42, Raymond was a crew chief, responsible for 7 men operating continuous miners in tunnels that stretched 2 miles into the mountain, some of them dropping 800 feet below the surface. The McAllister No. 7 mine was considered one of the safer operations in the region, with modern ventilation systems, good ground control, and a management team that actually listened when miners raised safety concerns. Raymond had seen his share of close calls, roof falls, equipment failures, a methane scare in 2015 that shut them down for 2 weeks, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what happened in the abandoned eastern section during the expansion project of March 2019. The company had decided to extend operations into a section of the mountain that had been sealed off in 1947 after a cave-in killed 6 men. The old maps showed good coal reserves in that direction, and modern ground penetration radar confirmed the seam extended at least another 1/4 mile. The plan was to bore through the sealed section carefully, reinforce as they went, and eventually recover the bodies of those 6 miners for proper burial while opening up a whole new production area. Raymond's crew drew the assignment. They started on a Monday morning, using a road header to cut through the concrete seal that had been poured 72 years earlier. The work went smoothly for the first 2 days. They punched through on Wednesday afternoon, and the stale air that rushed out smelled exactly like you'd expect: damp rock, old timber, and that particular mineral scent that coal miners know as well as their own skin. The sealed section was remarkably well preserved. The timber supports had rotted in places, but the roof remained stable. Equipment from the 1940s exactly where it had been abandoned. A locomotive coal cart on rails that ended at the cave-in, hand tools scattered around, lunch pails still sitting where men had left them when the mountain came down. The crew found 2 of the 6 bodies within the first hour, skeletal remains in rotted work clothes, their brass identification tags still readable. "We should say something," said Tommy Bledsoe, the youngest member of the crew at 26. "Feels wrong not to," Raymond agreed. They took off their hard hats and stood in silence for a moment, the ventilation fans humming in the background, before carefully bagging the remains for removal. The coroner would want them, and the families, what was left of them after 7 decades, deserved to finally lay their dead to rest. They found the 3rd body 50 feet deeper in a side tunnel that branched off the main shaft. This one was different. The bones were arranged wrong, scattered in a pattern that didn't match a cave-in or natural decay. They looked deliberately positioned, almost like they'd been sorted and laid out with care. The skull sat on top of a pile of other bones, ribs, femurs, vertebrae, all stacked in a cairn about 3 feet high. "What the hell?" muttered Frank Dempsey, Raymond's second in command. "Cave-in didn't do that." Raymond had to agree. He'd seen what falling rock did to human bodies, and this wasn't it. This looked intentional. He radioed to the surface, reported what they'd found, and was told to photograph everything and continue the survey. The company wanted to know the extent of recoverable coal before they made decisions about the remains. The crew pushed deeper into the sealed section, their capped lamps cutting through darkness that hadn't seen light in living memory. The tunnel extended much farther than the old maps indicated, branching into side galleries and shafts that weren't on any blueprint. Someone had done a lot of mining in here that wasn't officially recorded. They found the 4th body in one of these unmapped galleries, and this one stopped everyone cold. It was hanging from the ceiling. Not by a rope or chain. The body was embedded in the rock itself. The skeleton partially merged with the coal, seemed as if the stone had been soft when the person died and then hardened around them. The bones were black with coal dust, but you could still see they'd been broken in multiple places, snapped and twisted at angles that made Raymond's stomach turn. "We need to get out of here," Tommy said, backing away. "This ain't right. None of this is right." Raymond wanted to agree, but they had a job to do. He took photographs, made notes of the location, and led the crew deeper. They'd committed to the full extent of the sealed section, and miners didn't leave work unfinished. The tunnel opened into a chamber about 40 feet across, and that's where they found what the men had been digging for back in 1947. It wasn't coal. The wall at the far end of the chamber had been excavated to reveal something else, something that looked like it had been carved by human hands but couldn't have been. Symbols covered the exposed surface, inscribed into rock that geology said was 300 million years old, from the Carboniferous period when this whole region was a vast swamp forest. But the symbols weren't random marks from natural processes. They were deliberate, repeating patterns that almost looked like writing. In front of the carved wall, someone had built an altar of sorts, a platform made from timber and coal with objects placed on top. Raymond's cap lamp illuminated rusted tools, more brass identification tags. He counted 13, more than twice the number of men supposedly killed in the cave-in. And in the center, a wooden box about the size of a coffin. "Nobody touch anything," Raymond ordered, his voice tight. "We're documenting this and getting surface involved before the lights went out. Not just their cap lamps, the emergency lighting they'd strung as they advanced, the LED work floods, everything. Complete and absolute darkness, the kind that exists nowhere else on Earth except deep underground where no light has ever penetrated." Raymond's hand went to his lamp, trying the switch. Nothing. Around him, he heard his crew doing the same, the clicks of switches in the darkness, muttered curses, Tommy's breathing getting faster as panic set in. "Stay calm," Raymond said, forcing his voice steady. "Everyone stay exactly where you are. Frank, you have the backup radio." "Yeah, but it's not working, no power." That was impossible. The radio was battery-operated, separate from the mine's electrical system. Raymond tried his own radio. Dead. He pulled out his cell phone, knowing there'd be no service but hoping the flashlight would work. The screen wouldn't even light up. Then they heard it, scraping sounds from deeper in the chamber like something dragging itself across rock, slow and deliberate, moving in the darkness with them. The sound echoed strangely, coming from multiple directions at once, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. "Who's there?" Frank called out, his voice cracking. "This ain't funny." The scraping stopped. In the silence that followed, Raymond could hear his crews breathing, fast and shallow, on the edge of panic. Then a new sound started, tapping, rhythmic and regular like with a hammer and chisel. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. The same pattern over and over, coming from the direction of the carved wall. Light bloomed in the darkness, but not from any source Raymond recognized. A pale, greenish glow emanated from the symbols on the wall, pulsing in time with the tapping sounds. The illumination was faint, barely enough to see by, but after the complete darkness it seemed bright as day. The chamber was not empty. Things moved in the shadows at the edges of the green light, human-shaped but wrong in ways that made Raymond's mind rebel against processing what his eyes reported. They had the general proportions of men but moved in ways joints didn't bend, their limbs articulating at too many points. Their skin, if it was skin, looked like coal dust made solid, black and glittering in the strange light. There were dozens of them, maybe more, working at the walls with tools made from stone and bone, mining in complete silence except for that rhythmic tapping. They'd been here in the darkness, Raymond realized. Working for 72 years in the sealed section, maybe longer, maybe since the mountain was young. One of them turned toward the crew, and Raymond saw its face was almost human, almost recognizable. It took him a moment to realize he was looking at the coal-blackened features of a man who'd been dead for 7 decades, muscles and skin replaced by something else, but the underlying structure still intact enough to identify. The brass tag on its chest read Murphy. Murphy had been one of the 6 miners killed in 1947. "Run," Raymond whispered. Then, louder, "Run." The crew bolted for the tunnel exit, and the darkness came alive around them. The things that had been mining surged forward, moving faster than anything that size should move, their joints clicking and scraping as they pursued. Raymond ran blind, one hand on the tunnel wall, following the air current from the ventilation system, his crew's footsteps and panicked breathing echoing around him. Behind them, the green light grew brighter, and Raymond risked a glance back. The things were following, dozens of them, their coal-black bodies reflecting the eerie glow. Some crawled on the walls and ceiling, defying gravity. Others moved upright with that terrible articulated gait that shouldn't have been possible. Something grabbed Tommy's ankle. The young miner went down hard, screaming, and Raymond saw one of the things dragging him backward toward the chamber. Frank turned back, reaching for Tommy's hand, and another thing dropped from the ceiling onto his back. Its hands, if they were hands, closed around Frank's head. Raymond kept. God forgive him, he kept running, Tommy's screams echoing in the tunnel behind him, knowing he couldn't save them, knowing he'd barely save himself. His lungs burned, his legs felt like rubber, but he ran through the darkness toward where he remembered the sealed section entrance should be. He saw light ahead, normal electric light from the working section of the mine. 20 more feet, 15, 10. He burst through the opening they'd cut in the old seal, and the safety manager was there with 2 other miners, their faces shocked at Raymond's appearance. "Seal it," Raymond gasped. "Seal it now, get everyone out and seal this section forever." "What happened? Where's the rest of your seal it?" The screaming from inside the sealed section stopped abruptly. The greenish light faded. The things didn't pursue past the opening, Raymond realized. They couldn't or wouldn't leave the sealed section. But they were still there in the darkness, mining for something humans weren't meant to find. The company sealed the section that same day, pouring concrete 3 feet thick and posting it as an unstable hazard zone. The official report stated that Raymond's crew had encountered a pocket of toxic gas, causing hallucinations and disorientation. 2 miners lost to the gas, bodies unrecoverable due to collapse risk. Frank Dempsey and Tommy Bledsoe were declared dead, memorial services held, benefits paid to families. Raymond tried to tell people what really happened. He filed reports, talked to investigators, even went to the families with the truth. Nobody believed him. Toxic gas explained everything: the hallucinations, the panic, the tragic deaths. The company's psychiatrist put him on medical leave for trauma-related delusions. He never went back underground. Took his pension early. Moved to Lexington, where the mountains were just scenery in the distance, not places you entered. But sometimes he dreams about that chamber, about the symbols on the wall and the things that moved in the darkness. He dreams about Tommy and Frank, wonders if they're down there still, changed into something that mines in the eternal night, adding their labor to whatever project those things have been working on since the coal was young. And sometimes, when he drives past a coal mine on the highway, he swears he can feel them down there, feel the vibration of their ceaseless tapping transmitted through the bedrock, patient and eternal, digging deeper into the mountain's heart for reasons no living human can comprehend. Story 3. The Woman Who Wouldn't Stay Buried. Sarah Kincaid's grandmother died on a Tuesday, August 1987, which shouldn't have been remarkable except for the fact that she kept dying, over and over, for the next 6 weeks. Sarah was 15 years old that summer, living with her parents in Wise County, Virginia, in a hollow so narrow the sun only hit the valley floor for about 4 hours a day. Her grandmother, Ida Mee Kincaid, had lived in the same house for 63 years, a weathered clapboard structure built by Sarah's great-grandfather in 1924, situated at the end of a dirt road that wound 3 miles up from the nearest paved highway. Ida Mee had been sick for months, cancer eating through her liver and lungs, though she'd refused to go to the hospital in Bristol, saying she'd been born in that house and intended to die there. She got her wish. Sarah had been there when it happened, holding her grandmother's hand, while the old woman's breathing got shallower and shallower until it finally stopped. The local doctor came up, confirmed the death, and they made arrangements with Mullen's funeral home in town. The funeral was Thursday, a simple graveside service at the family cemetery up on the ridge behind the house. 4 generations of Kincaids were buried there, going back to the 1840s when the family first settled these mountains. The cemetery was small, maybe 30 plots, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that was more gap than fence at this point. Ida Mee's grave had been dug next to her husband's, who'd been dead since 1971. They laid her to rest at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the August heat oppressive and heavy, making the dozen mourners sweat through their funeral clothes. The preacher from the Methodist church in town said words over the casket. They lowered it into the ground, and everyone threw in a handful of dirt before heading back to the house for ham and potato salad and stories about Ida Mee's long life. Sarah's mother was the last to leave the cemetery, standing at the grave long after everyone else had gone, crying quietly. Sarah waited with her, uncomfortable in her black dress, swatting at gnats that swarmed in the humidity. Finally, her mother wiped her eyes, squeezed Sarah's hand, and they walked back to the house together. That night around 11 o'clock, Sarah was wakened by a sound outside her window, tapping, rhythmic and persistent like someone knocking on glass with a fingernail. She got up, pulled back the curtain, and saw her grandmother standing in the yard below, still wearing the blue dress they'd buried her in, her gray hair pinned up the way the funeral home had styled it. Sarah's scream brought her parents running. By the time her father was downstairs and outside with a flashlight, the yard was empty. They searched the property, found nothing, and her father concluded she'd had a nightmare, understandable after the stress of the funeral. Sarah knew what she'd seen, but she let them believe the nightmare story because the alternative was impossible. Friday morning, Sarah's uncle went up to the cemetery to place flowers on Ida Mee's grave. He came back white-faced and shaking, saying the grave was empty. Not dug up, the dirt was undisturbed, flowers still arranged on top. But when he'd noticed one corner of the grave had settled slightly and investigated, he could see down into the hole. The casket was open, empty. The sheriff came, then the funeral home, then half the county it seemed. They excavated the grave fully and confirmed what Sarah's uncle reported. The casket had been opened from the inside, the satin lining torn, but there was no sign of how anyone could have gotten out without disturbing the 6 feet of dirt above. No tunnels, no disturbance to the surrounding ground. The casket was simply empty, its occupant gone. Grave robbery was the official theory, though it made no sense. Ida Mee had been buried with her wedding ring and a pearl necklace, both still in the casket. Nothing had been taken. The sheriff investigated, found nothing, and eventually the case went cold under the classification of vandalism of unknown nature. Saturday night, Sarah saw her grandmother again. This time she was standing at the tree line beyond the yard, just visible in the moonlight. Sarah watched from her window, afraid to move, as the old woman stood there for nearly an hour before walking back into the woods. Sunday, one of the neighbors reported seeing Ida Mee on the road near the house, walking slowly downhill toward town. Monday, she was spotted in the cemetery again, standing by her own empty grave. People started talking. This was Appalachia, where the old beliefs ran deep alongside the Methodist and Baptist churches, where people still remembered the stories their grandparents told about haints and fetches and things that didn't rest easy in the ground. Some folks said Ida Mee had unfinished business. Others whispered about curses and sin, though nobody could say what sin Ida Mee might have committed worth being denied rest. Sarah's mother decided to try again. They had another funeral, another casket, another burial service. This time they didn't have a body to bury. They put Ida Mee's Bible and some of her clothes in the casket and sealed it with prayers and salt, following the advice of Sarah's who remembered the old ways. They buried it deep 8 feet instead of 6 and poured a concrete slab over the top. Ida Mee was in the yard that night. Sarah watched from her window as her grandmother approached the house, moving with a stiffness that hadn't been there in life, her skin gray in the moonlight. She tried the doors, finding them locked. She moved to the windows, pressing her face against the glass, her breath, because she was breathing, somehow, fogging the panes. Sarah's father called the sheriff, who arrived to find nothing. But the handprints were there on the windows the next morning, gray and dusty, and when they tested the residue, it came back as soil, grave dirt. The third burial was the following weekend. This time they enlisted the help of a priest from the Catholic Church 3 counties over, a young man fresh from seminary who was skeptical but willing. He performed a blessing, sprinkled holy water, and they buried the empty casket with all the proper rites. They surrounded the grave with iron, old tools, horseshoes, nails, and carved protective symbols into the headstone that the priest said came from the early church, used to keep the dead at rest. It didn't work. Ida Mee appeared more frequently now, not just at night. Sarah saw her in the garden in broad daylight, pulling weeds the way she had when alive. A delivery driver saw her on the porch and knocked to give her a package, then called the house in confusion when Sarah's mother answered, because he'd just seen Ida Mee and assumed the death announcement had been a mistake. The mailman refused to deliver to the house anymore after she waved to him from the upstairs window, the window of her old bedroom, which the family had kept locked since her death. Sarah's mother was on the edge of a breakdown. Her father drank more, staying up nights with a shotgun across his lap, though what good a gun would do against something that had already died was a question nobody wanted to answer. Sarah found herself almost getting used to it, catching glimpses of her grandmother in windows, in mirrors, standing at the edge of the woods watching the house. The fourth burial was a desperate measure. They dug up the grave again. The concrete slab had cracked, the iron scattered, and found the casket empty as before. This time they brought in a backhoe and went deeper, 12 feet down into the mountain, and they burned sage and cedar while lowering the casket. They filled the grave with salt mixed into the dirt, layered with more iron, and topped it with a concrete slab 3 times thicker than before, with scripture carved into it. That night was quiet, and the next night. By Wednesday, Sarah's mother was cautiously optimistic. They'd done it, finally put Ida Me to rest. The house felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on them for weeks seemed to lift. Thursday morning, Sarah found her grandmother in the kitchen. Not a glimpse through a window or a figure in the distance. Ida Me was sitting at the kitchen table, solid and real as life, wearing her old house dress instead of the funeral blue. She was snapping green beans into a bowl, the way she'd done 10,000 times when alive, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, unable to scream, unable to move. Her grandmother looked up and her eyes were wrong. Not the warm brown Sarah remembered, but milky and distant, like she was looking at something far away. "Sit down, child," Ida Me said, her voice exactly as Sarah remembered it. "We need to talk." Sarah's legs moved without her conscious decision, pulling out a chair, sitting across from her dead grandmother. Up close, she could see the wrongness more clearly. Ida Me's skin had a waxy quality, her movements were too smooth, and she didn't blink. But it was her grandmother's face, her voice, her hands snapping beans with muscle memory that death apparently hadn't erased. "You're scared," Ida Me said. "It wasn't a question." "I understand. I'm scared too. Didn't expect this, you see. Thought I'd die and that would be that. Heaven or hell or just nothing, but it wasn't nothing. It was worse than nothing." "Grandma, what happened?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "The ground won't take me," Ida Me said, still snapping beans, the pile growing in the bowl. "I try to stay down there, I do try, but something keeps pushing me back up. Something in the mountain don't want me, won't let me rest. And I'm so tired, Sarah, so awful tired." "What do you mean something in the mountain?" Ida Me's hand stopped moving. She looked at Sarah with those milky eyes, and for the first time since appearing in the kitchen, something like fear crossed her face. "This land's old, older than people. When my great-grandfather built here, the Cherokee tried to warn him off, said this hollow was wrong, that the mountain didn't want folks living in it. He didn't listen. Nobody ever listens. I don't understand. The bones in that cemetery," Ida Me continued, "they're not all quiet. Some nights I can hear them, moving under the ground, trying to rise up like me but can't quite manage it. They've been there too long, got too much earth in their marrow. But I'm fresh, see? Not enough dirt in me yet. So the mountain pushes me out, doesn't want me buried in it." Sarah's mother appeared in the doorway, saw Ida Me, and fainted. The sound of her hitting the floor made Ida Me look up, and something changed in her expression. She stood, the bones clattering to the floor. "I can't stay," she said. "It pulls at me even now, pulls me back to the grave even though it won't let me stay there. I'm caught, Sarah, caught between the ground that won't hold me and the world I can't properly live in anymore. Don't bury me there again. Burn me. Scatter the ashes in running water, get me away from this mountain. Promise me." "I promise," Sarah said, crying now. Ida Me reached out as if to touch Sarah's face, then pulled her hand back. "I'm not clean anymore," she said. "Got too much of the grave on me, too much of what's wrong with this place. Don't touch me, don't ever touch me. Just let me go proper this time." She walked to the back door, opened it, and stepped outside. Sarah watched from the window as her grandmother walked up the trail toward the cemetery, her form growing fainter with distance until she disappeared into the trees. They cremated what they found in the grave. Just bones this time, because Ida Me had left something physical behind, finally. The funeral home did it without asking too many questions, and Sarah and her father drove 3 hours north to scatter the ashes in the New River, moving water that flowed eventually to the Ohio and the Mississippi and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico, carrying Ida Mee far away from the mountain that wouldn't hold her. Sarah never saw her grandmother again after that. The house stopped feeling wrong, the oppressive weight lifted, and life returned to something approaching normal. But Sarah never forgot what Ida Mee said about the mountain, about the bones in the cemetery trying to rise. She moved away as soon as she could, went to college in Richmond, built a life far from those narrow hollows. She's 47 now, successful and settled, and she hasn't been back to that house in 20 years. Her parents are still there, aging in place, and they'll want to be buried in the family cemetery when their time comes. Sarah's already made it clear she'll cremate them, scatter their ashes in moving water, no matter what the family says, because some ground doesn't give back what you put in it. Some mountains are older than the dead, and they have their own ideas about what belongs in their bones. And if the price of rest is eternal rejection from the earth itself, wandering between worlds with grave dirt under your fingernails and nothing but tired in your bones, then Sarah will do whatever it takes to spare the people she loves from that fate. She still has nightmares sometimes, dreams where she's in that kitchen again, watching her grandmother snap beans with dead hands and milky eyes. In the dreams, Ida Mee always says the same thing. The mountain's still there, Sarah, still waiting. And someday, you too. Sarah wakes from those dreams in a cold sweat, in her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building built on bedrock that's been dead for 1 billion years, and she tells herself it's just a dream, just trauma from childhood, nothing more. But she knows, deep in her bones, in the place where blood remembers things the mind wants to forget, she knows that some hollows in those ancient mountains are wrong, and they don't let go of their dead. They never let go. Story 4. The Road That Eats Travelers. Daniel Pritchard drove a delivery truck for Cumberland Valley Freight, a regional carrier that serviced small towns across eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. For 11 years, he'd run the same basic route 5 days a week, picking up loads in Pikeville, delivering to dozens of stops across a 100-mile circuit, returning home to his wife and 2 kids by 6 o'clock most evenings. He knew every curve, every steep grade, every place where the road washed out in heavy rain. Route 80, Route 23, Highway 119, they were as familiar to him as his own driveway, which is why what happened in September 2016 made no sense whatsoever. It started on a Wednesday morning, the 21st, date specific because Daniel checked his manifests obsessively, and the paperwork for that day was later examined by multiple people trying to understand what occurred. He left the warehouse at 6:15 a.m., right on schedule, with a load of auto parts, feed supplements, and general merchandise bound for 11 stops between Elkhorn City and Pound, Virginia. The first 3 deliveries went normally. He made his usual stops, chatted with the receiving clerks he'd known for years, stayed on schedule. At 9:45 a.m., he left the Tractor Supply in Brakes, Virginia, and headed northeast on Route 80 toward his next stop in Hasey, about 23 miles away. This was a stretch of road he'd driven literally thousands of times, a 2-lane state highway that wound through the mountains, following creek valleys and ridge lines with the casual disregard for straight lines that characterized all mountain roads. At exactly 10:08 a.m., Daniel remembered checking the clock. He rounded a curve near Big Creek and found the road blocked by a landslide. Rocks and mud covered both lanes, with a small stream of water still trickling down from the exposed hillside above. This wasn't unusual. Slides happened, especially after the heavy rain they'd had the previous week. Protocol: call dispatch, report the closure, get rerouted. Daniel pulled over, grabbed his phone, and found he had no signal. Also not unusual, cell coverage in these mountains was spotty at best. He consulted his road atlas. He still carried paper maps, a habit from before GPS became standard, and identified an alternate route. Instead of continuing on Route 80, he could backtrack about 2 miles, take Quarry Road north, and connect with Highway 611, which would bring him into Hasey from a different direction. It would add maybe 30 minutes to his drive, but that was better than sitting around waiting for a road crew. He executed the U-turn and drove back to Quarry Road, a narrow county road that served a handful of houses and a long abandoned stone quarry. The road was paved, barely, with more potholes than smooth surface, but it was passable. Daniel had been on it once or twice before, years ago, though it wasn't part of his regular route. The first sign something was wrong came about a mile in. The road should have started climbing toward the ridge that separated this valley from the next, but it stayed level, following the creek through an increasingly narrow hollow. The trees pressed in close on both sides, old-growth hardwoods that blocked out most of the sunlight, making it feel like dusk even though it was mid-morning. Daniel checked his odometer. He should have reached the turnoff for Highway 611 by now, but there was no intersection, no cross road, just this narrow lane continuing into the hollow. He slowed down, looking for somewhere to turn around, and noticed the pavement under his tires looked wrong. Too new, too smooth, not the pothole-riddled county road he'd turned onto. A sign appeared on the right side of the road, Rest Area 2 MILES. Daniel hit the brakes. There was no rest area on Quarry Road. There wasn't a rest area anywhere in this county. Rest areas existed on interstates, maybe on major state routes, but not on forgotten county roads that barely saw a dozen cars a day. He continued forward slowly, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The hollow opened up slightly and buildings appeared through the trees. Not houses, commercial structures, old ones built in a style Daniel vaguely recognized from historical photos. Clapboard construction, hand-painted signs, a general store with a covered porch, a post office with U.S. mail stenciled on the window in gold leaf. Everything looked abandoned but well-preserved, like a ghost town maintained by someone who cared about authenticity. No other vehicles. People. Just these buildings sitting silent in the permanent twilight of the hollow. Daniel's instinct was to turn around, get the hell out of there, but the road was too narrow and his truck too long. He'd need to find a wider spot or a driveway. He crept forward, passing the store, the post office, a building that might have been a school. At the edge of the settlement, the road widened into what looked like a town square, and there, finally, was enough room to turn around. As he was executing a multi-point turn, he saw the rest area sign hadn't been lying. There was indeed a rest area, a gravel lot with picnic tables and a small stone building that was probably a bathroom. And there was a car in the lot, a Ford Model A dark blue in pristine condition. Daniel finished his turn and his headlights swept across the car. Someone was sitting in it. A man in old-fashioned clothes, suit, tie, hat, visible through the driver's side window. The man turned to look at Daniel, and even at a distance of 30 feet, Daniel could see his expression of confusion and fear. The man got out of the car, stumbling slightly, and Daniel could see he was young, maybe 30, his clothing definitely from another era. The 1930s, maybe, based on the cut of his suit and the style of his hat. He raised a hand, waving frantically, and started walking toward Daniel's truck. Daniel didn't wait. He gunned the engine, his truck lurching forward, and drove back the way he'd come, past the abandoned buildings, into the narrow section of road where the trees pressed close. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming fast, and he kept checking his rearview mirror expecting to see the Model A following him, but the road behind remained empty. The road itself seemed different now. Longer. He drove for what felt like 10 minutes, 15, his odometer clicking off miles, but he didn't reach the turnoff back to Route 80. The hollow just continued, the creek running alongside, the trees creating that perpetual twilight. Then he passed the settlement again. Same buildings, same town square. Daniel hit the brakes, confusion, overwhelming fear for a moment. He'd been driving in a straight line. The road didn't curve back on itself, didn't loop. It was physically impossible to have returned to the same location. The Model A was still in the rest area. The man in the old suit was standing next to it, no longer looking confused. He was staring directly at Daniel's truck, his face set in an expression of grim understanding. Daniel floored it, not caring about speed limits or safety, just wanting to get away from this place. The truck's diesel engine roared, the speedometer climbing to 50, 60, too fast for the narrow road, but Daniel didn't care. Trees blurred past. The creek became a silver streak in his peripheral vision. He drove for 20 minutes this time, watching the odometer, watching the clock. The road remained the same, narrow, shadowed, following the creek that apparently had no end. And then, inevitably, the buildings appeared again. But this time there were more cars in the rest area, maybe a dozen spanning decades. Daniel saw the Model A, a 1950s Chevrolet, a 1970s pickup truck, a 1990s Honda sedan, and vehicles from the 2000s. And people, figures standing in the square next to the cars, all of them wearing clothes from different eras, all of them turning to look as Daniel's truck appeared. They started walking toward him. Daniel reversed, the truck's backup alarm beeping insistently, and swung around, driving back the way he'd come yet again. But now he could see figures in his headlights ahead of him too, people walking in the road, materializing from the trees, all wearing clothes from different times, all with that same expression of grim understanding. He drove through them, or thought he did. They seemed to step aside at the last moment, or maybe they weren't quite solid, he couldn't tell. His truck passed through the spaces where they'd been standing, and in his rearview mirror he could see them continue walking, following him. Panic was fully in control now. Daniel's training, his years of experience, meant nothing. He was lost on a road that looped impossible on itself, in a place that collected travelers from across decades, and he could feel the place trying to add him to its collection. The fuel gauge caught his eye, quarter tank. He'd started the day with a full tank, and in normal driving he should still have 3/4 left, but the gauge showed quarter and dropping. Somehow he'd burned through 3/4 of a tank driving in circles on a road that shouldn't exist, 1/8 of a tank. The low fuel warning light came on. Daniel forced himself to think. The road looped. Every time he tried to drive out, he came back to the settlement. But what if he didn't follow the road? What if he went off-road, crashed through the trees, found a different way out? He spotted a gap in the trees where the creek widened, creating a gravel bar. It wasn't much, but it was an opening. Daniel cranked the wheel hard, left the pavement, and drove onto the gravel. The truck bounced over rocks, splashed through shallow water, and smashed through saplings on the far side of the creek. He was in the woods now, no road at all, just trees and undergrowth. The truck forced its way, branches scraping the sides, the undercarriage banging over rocks and logs. The fuel gauge showed empty, the engine warning lights beginning to illuminate on the dash. Then the trees opened up and Daniel burst onto pavement. Real pavement, state highway pavement, and there was a sign, HAYSI 12 miles. Highway 611. He'd found it, or it had found him. Daniel didn't stop to question it. He drove the 12 miles to Hasey, his gauge showing empty the entire way, the engine somehow continuing to run. He pulled into the first gas station he found, filled the tank with shaking hands, and sat in the cab for 20 minutes trying to compose himself enough to complete his delivery. The clock on his dashboard showed 2:15 p.m. He'd been lost on that impossible road for over 4 hours, but he'd only burned enough fuel for maybe 3 hours of driving. Time had worked differently there, just like space. Daniel made his deliveries, finished his route, and drove back to the warehouse. He didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe him? Instead, he filed his paperwork, went home, and tried to forget about it. But he couldn't. Over the following weeks, Daniel became obsessed with researching Quarry Road. He found old maps from the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and discovered that a settlement had existed in that hollow, a mining town called Deeplow, population never more than 200, which had been abandoned in 1936 after the mine closed. And there were stories of travelers who'd taken wrong turns and ended up in places that shouldn't exist, roads that looped forever, hollows that trapped the unwary. In Appalachian folklore, these were called fairy roads, or haint paths, places where the boundary between the normal world and somewhere else wore thin. Daniel found a newspaper article from 1932 about a man named James Collier who'd left Pikeville to drive to Pound and was never seen again. His car, a Ford Model A, was found 6 months later on an abandoned logging road. No sign of Collier, no explanation for how the car had gotten there. A dark blue Ford Model A, Daniel quit his job the next week, took an early retirement deal, moved his family to Lexington, found work doing local deliveries that never took him into the deep mountains. He's 53 now, and he hasn't been back to that part of Kentucky since. But sometimes he thinks about that road, about the settlement that shouldn't exist and the travelers trapped there from across the decades. They're still there, still waiting, still trying to find a way out. He wonders what would have happened if his fuel had actually run out, if he'd been stranded on that impossible road. And he wonders how many other roads like that exist in these mountains, how many hollow roads and forgotten paths that loop back on themselves, collecting travelers who made one wrong turn and could never find their way home. The mountains are old, older than the roads built through them, and they don't always follow the rules that govern the world outside their boundaries. Daniel has nightmares about being back there, driving in circles, watching the fuel gauge drop while figures from across time gather in the settlement, waiting. In his nightmares, he runs out of fuel, becomes one of them, another traveler added to the collection. And the worst part is, in the dreams he knows that somewhere, someday, another driver will make a wrong turn and see him standing there next to his truck, wearing his 2016 clothes, a relic from a different time, trapped forever on the road that eats travelers and never lets them go. Story 5. The Last Song of Sarah Horne. Marcus Whitley had been collecting Appalachian folk music for the Library of Congress since 1978, traveling through Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina with recording equipment and an anthropologist's patience, documenting the old songs before they disappeared with the people who remembered them. He was 49 years old in the summer of 1993, carrying 78 cataloged recordings and a reputation for finding singers others had missed. The shut-ins, the elderly folks in remote hollows, the ones who still remembered songs from before the Civil War. In late June, Marcus was working his way through Breathitt County, Kentucky, when a postmaster in Lost Creek mentioned Sarah Horne. "She's 94, the postmaster said, lives up Troublesome Creek, hasn't come down from that hollow in maybe 30 years. Her granddaughter brings supplies, but I've heard she can sing, knows songs nobody else remembers." Marcus got directions, such as they were, and drove his pickup truck as far up the creek as the road allowed, then hiked the last 2 miles on a trail that was more suggestion than path. The hollow was narrow and deep, the kind of place where the sun only reached the bottom for an hour or two at midday. Sarah Horne's cabin sat in a small clearing, a 2-room structure built from hand-hewn logs, probably 100 years old, roof and a sagging porch. Sarah herself appeared when Marcus called out from a respectful distance, protocol in these parts, where showing up unannounced could get you shot. She was tiny, maybe 4'10", bent with age but with eyes that were sharp and clear. Her skin had the texture of old leather, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. She wore a faded flower print dress and no shoes. "Hooray you," she called, her voice stronger than Marcus expected. "Marcus Whitley, ma'am. I work for the Library of Congress collecting old songs. The postmaster in Lost Creek said you might know some worth recording. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then gestured him forward. Recording, like on a radio. Similar, yes ma'am. With permission, I'd record you singing, preserve the songs for future generations. She nodded slowly. My granddaughter mentioned you. Said you've been around asking about old songs. Said you're respectful, pay people for their time. Yes, ma'am. Standard rate is $50 per song recorded, and I always get permission before. Don't want your money, Sarah interrupted. But I'll sing for you. Been carrying these songs too long. Time to pass them on before I forget them entirely. Over the next 4 hours, sitting on her porch while the sun moved across the narrow slice of sky visible between the mountains, Sarah sang 17 songs. Marcus recorded them all, his equipment capturing her voice, thin and wavery with age but true in pitch, with a quality he couldn't quite name. Haunting, maybe. Ancient. The songs were extraordinary. Ballads Marcus had never heard, murder ballads and love songs and songs about death that predated anything in his collection. Some were versions of known songs but with verses he'd never encountered. Others seemed completely unique, possibly unrecorded anywhere else in the world. The 17th song was different. Sarah had been tiring, her voice growing rougher, and Marcus was about to suggest they stop for the day when she said, "One more, the last one. The one I've never sung for anyone." "You don't have to," Marcus said. "We can." "No, I need to sing it. Been carrying it since I was 12 years old and I'm 94 now. 82 years is too long to hold on to something like this. Time to let it go." She closed her eyes, was silent for a moment, then began to sing. The melody was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard, modal, shifting between keys in ways that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The lyrics were in English, but the phrasing was strange, archaic, with words Marcus didn't recognize. The song told a story about a woman who went into the mountains looking for her lost child and found a hillside. And beyond the door was a place where the dead lived in a mirror of the world above. The woman in the song went through the door and found her child. But the child had changed, had become something that only looked like her daughter. The woman tried to bring the child back, but the dead don't return. The song ended with the woman trapped on the other side of the door in the place where the dead live, and her own people finding her body outside the doorway, eyes open, mouth frozen mid-scream. Sarah's voice changed as she sang, becoming clearer, stronger, losing the wavering quality of age. For a few moments, Marcus could hear what her voice must have sounded like at 12 years old, pure and powerful. Then the song ended, and Sarah slumped in her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 94 years. "You all right, ma'am?" Marcus asked, concerned. Sarah nodded slowly. "That song, my grandmother taught it to me, made me memorize it, every word, every note. Said it had been passed down in our family for generations, back before we came to Kentucky, back when we lived in the old country, Scotland maybe, or Ireland. She said it wasn't just a song, it was a warning, a true story." "A warning about what?" "About the doors," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The places where the living world touches the dead. My grandmother said they're real, hidden in these mountains. Said our family used to guard them, keep people from opening them, but we forgot. The knowledge got lost. Now there's just the song, and I was the last one who knew it." Marcus felt a chill despite the June heat. "What do you mean, doors?" "Caves, mostly. Hollows where the rock sits different. Places where something old sleeps or watches. My grandmother said you can feel them if you pay attention. The air changes, gets heavy. Animals won't go near. Trees grow strange. And if you're fool enough to go inside, you might find the door. And if you open it," she trailed off, shaking her head. "What happens if you open it? The dead come through or you go to them. Either way, it's not natural. The worlds aren't meant to mix." Sarah opened her eyes, looked at Marcus with an intensity that made him lean back. "You recorded that song. It's on your machine now. That's good. Let other people know. Let them be warned. But Marcus Whitley, don't you ever sing it. Don't you let anyone else sing it either. It's a teaching song, a remembering song, not a singing song, you understand?" Yes ma'am, but why not sing it? what would happen? Sarah stood, moving to the door of her cabin. That song is a key, she said. The melody, the words, they open things that should stay closed. My grandmother said that's why it had to be passed down exact, every note perfect. If you sing it wrong, nothing happens. But sing it right in the right place and you'll call what's on the other side of the doors. They'll hear you. They'll answer. Marcus left shortly after, hiking back down to his truck with his equipment and his recordings, his mind churning. He'd collected hundreds of songs, heard countless superstitions and folk beliefs, but something about Sarah Horn's warning felt different. She'd been completely serious, completely convinced of what she was saying. He didn't see Sarah again. She died that winter, peacefully in her sleep, according to her granddaughter. Marcus attended the funeral, paid his respects, and added her recordings to his collection. The song bothered him. He transcribed it, notated the melody, but he never played the recording for anyone. He told himself it was out of respect for Sarah's wishes, but the truth was, the song unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. Listening to it alone in his office gave him headaches, made him feel like the air pressure was changing, like something was paying attention to him from a very long distance away. In 1997, Marcus was working with a graduate student named Linda Chen, who was writing her dissertation on Appalachian murder ballads. She was going through his collection, cataloging and analyzing songs when she came across the Sarah Horn recordings. "This last one is incredible," Linda said, playing it over her headphones. "The modal shifts, the melodic structure, it's unlike anything else in the collection. We should publish this, get it into circulation." "No," Marcus said quickly. "That one's not for publication. It stays in the archive." "Why?" "The recording quality is excellent. The song is clearly significant. Because Sarah Horn asked me not to share it, not to let anyone sing it." Linda looked skeptical. "With all due respect, Professor Whitley, we're preserving cultural heritage, not honoring superstitions. This song deserves to be heard." They argued about it for weeks. Linda was persistent, and eventually Marcus compromised. She could include a written transcription in her dissertation, but not the recording. No audio, no performance instructions, just the lyrics and basic melodic notation. Linda agreed, though she thought Marcus was being ridiculous. The dissertation was completed in 1998. 3 copies were printed and bound, filed in the university library and the Library of Congress. Linda moved on to a teaching position at UNC Chapel Hill. Marcus retired in 2001, satisfied he'd preserved something important while respecting Sarah's warning. Then in 2004, he got a call from Linda. "Someone sang it," she said, her voice shaky. "A student found my dissertation, saw the transcription, and sang it for a class presentation on Appalachian folk music. She sang it in one of the caves in the Linville Gorge, thought it would be atmospheric." "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "What happened?" "She disappeared 3 days ago. There was a search party, they found her backpack at the cave entrance, but no sign of her. And Marcus. They found something else. Marks on the cave wall that weren't there before. Fresh marks carved deep into the limestone. The same symbols that appear in some of the old ballads about fairy roads and haint hollows." Marcus drove to North Carolina that night. He met Linda at the sheriff's office in Burke County, and together they hiked to the cave, a narrow opening in a limestone outcrop, unremarkable except for the complete absence of any sound. No birds, no insects, just oppressive silence. The marks were real. Spirals and geometric patterns carved into the rock just inside the cave entrance. The stone still showing fresh chisel marks even though no one had reported seeing them before. And deeper in the cave, just at the edge of flashlight range, was a darkness that seemed thicker than normal shadow, more substantial. The student, Rebecca Moore, was never found. The official explanation was that she'd gotten lost in the cave system, though experienced cavers said the cave was barely 30 feet deep with no side passages. Rebecca's family hired private searchers, spent thousands of dollars, found nothing. Marcus pulled the Sarah Horn recording from circulation entirely. He tried to have Linda's dissertation copies removed from libraries, but they were part of the permanent record. He wrote letters to folklorists and musicologists, warning them not to perform the song, but most thought he'd lost his mind. The few who took him seriously agreed to note the song as performance restricted in their catalogs. Linda quit academia. She couldn't shake the guilt over Rebecca's disappearance, couldn't escape the feeling that she'd released something that should have stayed contained. She moved to Portland, became an accountant, and never spoke publicly about Appalachian music again. Marcus is 79 now, still alive, still worried. He knows there are copies of that song out there in dissertations and archives and digital collections. He knows that someday someone else will sing it, probably in another cave or hollow where the boundaries are thin. And he knows what Sarah Horn tried to tell him, that some songs aren't meant to be sung, that some knowledge isn't meant to be preserved, that the old people kept certain things secret for very good reasons. He's made a When he dies, the Sarah Horn recordings are to be sealed for 100 years, access restricted, the song removed from all digital databases he can control. It won't be enough. Linda's dissertation is still out there, the transcription accessible to anyone with library access. But it's what he can do. Late at night, Marcus sometimes hears the melody in his head, note perfect after all these years. Sarah's voice singing about the woman who went through the door, about the dead living in their mirror world, about the price of trying to bring back what's lost. He never hums it, never lets the notes pass his lips. He knows that somewhere in these mountains, the doors are still there, hidden in caves and hollows, and the things on the other side are listening, always listening, waiting for someone to sing the song that calls them into the world of the living. And he knows that Sarah Horn was right. 82 years she'd carried that song without singing it. She'd understood what most folklorists and academics don't, that some stories aren't just entertainment or cultural artifacts. Some stories are warnings, some songs are keys, and some knowledge should die with the people who remember it, buried in graves and lost to time, because the cost of preservation is higher than anyone wants to pay. Story 6. The Face in the Window Frost. Cheryl Ann Dodson grew up in a farmhouse built by her great-great-grandfather in 1887, situated in a narrow valley in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, where the Allegheny Mountains rose steep and dark on 3 sides. The house was solid, chestnut logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone foundation, and windows that had been replaced only twice in over a century. Cheryl's family had farmed the bottom land and run cattle on the slopes for 5 generations, and despite opportunities to move to town, to sell the land to developers or mining companies, they'd stayed. This was their place, their heritage, their responsibility to maintain. Cheryl was 8 years old the first winter she saw the face. It was January 1989, and West Virginia was in the grip of a cold snap that had temperatures dropping below zero for 2 weeks straight. The kind of cold that made the house's old boards crack and pop at night, that froze the creek solid enough to walk on, that created fantastic ice formations on the windows, ferns and flowers, and geometric patterns that looked like something from a fairy tale. Cheryl's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, on the north side of the house, where the sun rarely reached in winter. The window accumulated the thickest frost, sometimes over an inch of crystalline ice on the inside of the glass. She loved looking at the patterns, making up stories about ice princesses and frozen kingdoms. On the morning of January 14th, she woke to find something different in the frost. A face. Not a random pattern that coincidentally looked face-like, an actual face, rendered in ice with deliberate detail. Eyes, nose, mouth, even suggestions of cheekbones and a brow. It was beautiful in its way, delicate and precise, though the expression was sad or maybe afraid. Cheryl called her mother, who came upstairs and stood in the doorway staring at the window. "That's unusual," her mother said, her voice carefully neutral. Must be how the moisture froze. Patterns can look like all sorts of things. But Cheryl could tell her mother was disturbed. She stood there too long, looked too carefully, and when she finally left, she told Cheryl's father about it in a hushed conversation Cheryl wasn't supposed to overhear. The next morning, the face was still there, unchanged despite the bedroom window having been opened briefly for fresh air. New frost should have formed, obscuring or altering the pattern, but the face remained exactly as it had been, as if preserved somehow. And it had changed position. The face wasn't looking forward anymore. It had turned slightly to the side, as if looking toward the bedroom door. Cheryl's father scraped the frost off that afternoon, using a putty knife to remove every trace of ice from the glass. He did it while Cheryl was at school, and when she came home, the window was clear. "There," he said, "no more faces, just frost playing tricks." But the next morning, the face was back. Same position as before, turned to the side, looking toward the door. And over the following week, it continued to change. Each morning, it had moved slightly, its gaze shifting to track around the room. By the seventh morning, it was looking directly at Cheryl's bed. That's when Cheryl's grandmother got involved. Nora Dodson was 73, sharp as a tack, and the repository of family history and mountain lore. She came up to Cheryl's room, studied the frost face for a long time, and then did something that surprised everyone. She went to the attic and brought down a box of old photographs, some of them dating back to the 1890s. She spread them on Cheryl's bed and began sorting through them, holding them up to compare to the face in the frost. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a tintype photograph from around 1893 showing a young woman in a high-collared dress, her expression serious the way in old photographs. The resemblance was unmistakable. "That's Emily Dodson," Nora said quietly. "Your great-great-grandfather's sister. She died in this house when she was 19. It was winter, January of 1894. They said it was pneumonia, but..." She trailed off, looking at the frost face, then at the photograph. "But what?" Cheryl's mother asked. "There were stories," Nora said. "Stories I heard from my grandmother, who heard them from her mother-in-law, about Emily being afraid of something, seeing something in the woods that last winter, about her refusing to go outside, refusing to let anyone open the windows, about her screaming in the night, saying it was trying to get in. They thought she was delirious with fever, but what if she wasn't?" "Mom, you're scaring Cheryl," Cheryl's father said. "She should be scared," Nora replied, "because Emily died in this room, in the bed Cheryl sleeps in, and if she's showing herself in the frost, she's trying to tell us something." They moved Cheryl to a different bedroom that night, one on the south side of the house. Her old room was closed up, the door shut and locked. But Cheryl could hear sounds from in there, scratching like fingernails on glass, and sometimes a voice, faint and female, saying words she couldn't quite make out. The frost face appeared in other windows now. Always the same face, always Emily, but moving from room to room. The kitchen window one morning, the parlor window the next. Each time looking inward, her expression growing more desperate, more afraid. Nora did research. She went through family papers, old letters, diaries. What she found made the situation worse. Emily Dodson had indeed been afraid of something in the winter of 1893-1894. Her diary, found in a trunk in the attic, detailed escalating terror. She wrote about seeing a figure in the woods, tall and thin, that watched the house, about hearing tapping on her window at night, gentle and persistent, about frost forming in patterns that looked like hands, like faces that weren't hers, like symbols she didn't recognize. The final entry, dated January 11, 1894, 3 days before she died, read, "It spoke to me through the frost. It knows my name. It says it's been waiting, and winter is when the barrier is thinnest. It says cold opens doors that should stay closed. I've stopped letting them open the windows, but I don't think that matters anymore. It's already inside. I can feel it in the walls, in the floor. Tonight, I heard it breathing under my bed." Cheryl's family didn't know what to do with this information. They contacted their pastor, who blessed the house and prayed over Cheryl's old bedroom, but the frost continued. They contacted a paranormal investigation team from Charleston, who spent a weekend with equipment and left with data they said was inconclusive but concerning. Then February came, and the cold snap broke. Temperatures rose above freezing for the first time in a month. The ice on the windows melted. The frost faces disappeared. Cheryl thought it was over. Spring came, then summer, then fall, and there were no more manifestations. Life returned to normal. She moved back into her old bedroom, slept soundly, and tried to forget about frost faces and Emily's diary. Winter returned, and with the first hard freeze in December, the face came back. But this time, it wasn't just Emily. Now there were two faces in the frost, Emily and something else. The other face was wrong, not human, though it tried to imitate human features. The proportions were off, the symmetry imperfect, and where Emily's face showed fear, this one showed hunger. Cheryl was 11 now, old enough to understand she was in danger, old enough to be properly terrified. She slept in other rooms, at friends' houses, anywhere but her own bedroom. But the faces followed. They appeared on whatever window was nearest to where she slept. Always two now. Emily's face desperate and warning, the other face patient and waiting. Nora brought in a folk healer from back in the mountains, a woman named Granny Rife who knew the old ways. Granny Rife walked the property, read the signs, and delivered her verdict. Something's been trying to get into this house since before Emily died. She didn't let it in when she was alive, so it took her when she died, trapped her on the threshold between. Now she's caught, can't go forward, can't go back. And the thing that took her is still trying to get the rest of the way through. Using the cold, using her. Every winter it gets a little stronger. How do we stop it? Cheryl's father asked. Can't stop winter, Granny Rife said. And you can't help Emily, she's too far gone. But you can protect the living. Need to seal the house proper. Salt in the window frames, iron nails in the sills, prayers carved into the lintels. Old protections that people used to know but forgot. They did everything Granny Rife instructed. They carved Bible verses into the wood above every door and window. They mixed salt into white paint and repainted all the trim. They drove iron nails into the sills according to patterns Granny Rife drew out. It took weeks of work, and it cost thousands of dollars, but by mid-December the house was as sealed as they could make it. The first hard freeze came December 20th. Cheryl woke the next morning and immediately checked her window. Formed, but no faces. Just normal crystal patterns, random and beautiful and meaningless. For 3 years the protections worked. Winters came and went without incident. Cheryl graduated high school, went to college at West Virginia University, and came home for holidays without fear. Then, in December 1996, during Cheryl's sophomore year, her father decided to replace the windows. The old ones were drafty and inefficient. New double-pane windows would save on heating costs, he reasoned. He didn't think about the fact that replacing the windows would disturb all the protections they'd put in place. Cheryl came home for Christmas break to find construction in progress. Half the windows had already been replaced, the old protections removed and discarded. The faces returned that night. Not just two now, dozens. Every window in the house bloomed with frost faces. Emily's repeated over and over, and the other thing, the wrong face, larger than before, more detailed. And this time they didn't just watch. The windows began to crack, hairline fractures spreading through the glass, and through those cracks cold air poured in. Not normal cold, this was something else, something that made the air itself hurt to breathe, that created ice on the inside walls, that turned the house into a freezer even with the heat running full blast. Cheryl's family evacuated. They left the house and spent Christmas in a motel in Lewisburg while they tried to figure out what to do. Granny Rife was dead by then, and Nora was in a nursing home with advanced dementia. There was nobody left who knew the old protections, the old ways of sealing a house against what lived in the deep winter cold. They sold the property in 1997. A developer bought it, planning to tear down the old house and build vacation cabins. But the demolition crew refused to work on it after the first day. They reported seeing faces in any ice that formed, hearing voices in the walls, and feeling watched by something that didn't like them being there. The house still stands, empty now for 28 years. The windows are all broken, the doors hang open, and squatters don't stay more than a night. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to spend time there, but nobody lasts until morning. And every winter, when the temperature drops and frost forms, the faces appear. Emily Dodson, forever trapped on the threshold between worlds, her expression frozen in eternal warning. And the other thing, the presence that tried to use her to gain entry that almost succeeded in coming through. Cheryl is 43 now, living in Virginia Beach, as far from mountains and winter as she can get. She's never gone back to Greenbrier County, never visited the old farmhouse, though she sometimes sees it in nightmares. In her dreams, it's winter and she's in her childhood bedroom and Emily's face forms in the frost. But this time, the face speaks and the words are clear. It's still waiting. Winter is when the barrier is thinnest, and someday someone will open the door all the way. The cold will come through and it will never leave. Cheryl wakes from these dreams in a sweat despite her bedroom's climate control, and she checks the weather obsessively, dreading cold snaps and hard freezes. She's made sure her apartment has no single-pane windows, nowhere for frost to form in patterns. She keeps her heat high enough that condensation can't build up on the glass. But sometimes, on the coldest nights when the temperature drops unexpectedly, she sees it anyway. Just for a moment, just a glimpse. A face forming in the fog her breath makes on a cold car window. Emily's face, still trying to warn her, still trapped in the winter that never ends. And behind Emily, barely visible, something else. Something patient. Something that knows that doors, once opened even a crack, can eventually be forced the rest of the way. Something that understands that winter comes every year, and every year the cold gives it another chance to finish what it started in 1894. Story 7. The Hollow That Swallowed Sound. Ethan Marshall was a sound engineer and environmental audio recordist, specializing in capturing natural soundscapes for documentaries, museums, and academic research. Over his 18-year career, he'd recorded in rainforests, deserts, Arctic tundra, and deep oceans, building a library of thousands of hours of pristine environmental audio. In May 2014, at 42 years old, he received a commission from the National Park Service to document the soundscapes of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, focusing on old growth sections that retained something approaching their pre-industrial acoustic character. Ethan arrived in late May with high-end recording equipment, multiple binaural microphones, hydrophones for recording streams, ultrasonic recorders for bat populations, and computer systems for analyzing and cataloging his work. The Park Service provided him with maps of the most pristine sections of the forest, areas far from roads and trails where human noise was minimal. One area on the map caught his attention: Stillwater Hollow, marked as old-growth forest with limited access, located in a drainage basin between two ridges about 6 miles from the nearest trail. The topography suggested it would be acoustically interesting, a narrow valley that would channel sound in specific ways, create natural echoes and reverberations, perfect for his purposes. Ethan hiked in on June 3rd, carrying 70 pounds of equipment on his back, planning to set up a base camp and record for 3 days. The hike took most of the day, the trail disappearing entirely after the first 4 miles, leaving him to navigate by GPS and compass. The hollow was exactly as the map suggested, a narrow valley with steep sides, a small creek running through it, and trees that were easily 300 years old. Hemlock, oak, and poplar grew to enormous size, their canopy creating a twilight even at noon. He set up his tent near the creek and began placing microphones. His standard setup involved positioning multiple recording points throughout a location, capturing sound from different perspectives and distances, which he'd later mix into a comprehensive soundscape. He worked methodically, hanging microphones from trees, positioning ground-level units near the creek, setting up his ultrasonic array for night recording. That's when he noticed the first oddity. His voice sounded wrong. When he spoke aloud, giving verbal notes for his recordings, his words seemed to vanish immediately, with no echo, no reverberation, nothing. In a hollow this size and shape, he should have heard distinct echoes. Instead, his voice died within a few feet, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. Ethan found this interesting rather than alarming. Unusual acoustic properties were part of what made locations valuable for recording. He made notes about the phenomenon and continued setting up his equipment. He started recording at 6 p.m., planning to capture the evening chorus. Birds settling, nocturnal animals becoming active, the transition from day to night. He put on his headphones, monitoring the input from his primary microphone array. Silence. Not quiet silence. Absolute absence of sound. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees, not even the creek which he could see flowing 10 feet away. His equipment was working. He could hear the faint hum of the electronic system, the sound of his own breathing in the headphones, but nothing environmental was coming through. Ethan checked connections, swapped microphones, verified his systems. Everything was functioning correctly. The microphones were capturing sound. When he tapped one, the thump came through clearly. But the forest itself was producing nothing. This was impossible. Even the quietest environments produced ambient sound. Air moving, water flowing, small animals, something. Ethan had recorded in the Atacama Desert, one of the quietest places on Earth, and even there he'd captured wind and the occasional insect. But this hollow was producing literally nothing. He took off the headphones and listened with his naked ears. He could hear the creek faintly. A bird called from somewhere in the distance, though the sound seemed muffled and strange. But when he put the headphones back on, connected to microphones positioned all around the hollow, there was only silence. The professional part of Ethan's brain found this fascinating. Some acoustic phenomenon was occurring that he didn't understand, something that affected recorded sound but not direct perception. This could be a significant discovery, potentially publishable in acoustic journals. The primitive part of his brain, the part that still listened to instinct, wanted him to pack up and leave immediately. Ethan compromised. He'd stay the night, continue recording, gather data, and see what happened. Science required observation, and he'd never encountered anything like this. Night fell. Ethan sat by his tent, monitoring his equipment, watching levels that should have been dancing with input but remained flatlined. At 8:30 p.m., he saw a deer walk through the hollow, maybe 40 feet away, clearly visible in his flashlight beam. It stepped on branches, moved through undergrowth, should have been producing all kinds of noise. His directional microphone was pointed right at it. Silence on the recording. The deer stopped, looked directly at him, and Ethan noticed its mouth was open, tongue lolling. It was panting, breathing hard, clearly making sounds. But his microphones captured nothing. Then the deer ran, crashing through the undergrowth in obvious panic, and for just a moment Ethan's equipment registered sound, branches breaking, leaves rustling before going silent again as the deer disappeared from his sight. A pattern was emerging. His equipment only captured sound from things he could see. Anything beyond his visual range, anything in the darkness or behind trees, produced no recordable sound. It was as if sound itself couldn't travel more than line of sight in this place. Ethan packed a handheld recorder and a flashlight and started walking the hollow, conducting an experiment. He'd go to one of his remote microphone positions, make noise, and see if it registered on the equipment back was monitoring wirelessly. 20 feet from camp, his voice stopped registering on the monitors. 30 feet, and snapping branches didn't register. 40 feet, and he could scream as loud as he wanted. He could hear himself, echoes bouncing off the hillsides, but the equipment showed nothing. Sound couldn't travel more than about 30 feet in this hollow. Beyond that range, it simply disappeared, absorbed by something. Ethan stood in the darkness, his flashlight creating a circle of visibility, and felt the first real stirrings of fear. This wasn't just an interesting acoustic phenomenon. This was a violation of physics, of how sound worked. Sound waves didn't just vanish. They traveled through air according to predictable principles. What he was experiencing was impossible. He turned to walk back to camp and saw lights in the woods. Not flashlights, these were different. Pale, greenish glows that seemed to float between the trees, moving slowly, bobbing up and down. Ethan counted 6, then 8, then lost count as more appeared. They were all around him, distributed through the hollow, moving without any apparent pattern. His rational mind suggested bioluminescence, foxfire, glowing fungi, something natural. But these lights moved too purposefully, too independently, and they were getting closer. Ethan ran. He crashed back to his camp, stumbling over roots and rocks, and burst into the clearing where his tent stood. The lights didn't follow into the open space. They stayed in the trees, hovering at the edge of visibility, watching. Ethan grabbed his satellite phone. He'd brought it for emergencies and tried to call for help. The phone showed a strong signal, but when he dialed, nothing happened. No ring, no connection tone, just silence. He tried texting. Messages wouldn't send. The lights began to move into the clearing. As they got closer, Ethan could see they weren't floating independently. Each light was being carried by something. Figures, vaguely human-shaped but wrong in proportions. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at too many joints. They moved silently, of course silently. Sound didn't exist here except in limited range, and they were converging on his camp. Ethan made a decision born of pure panic. He grabbed his most expensive equipment, the computer with his life's work of recordings, and ran. He left everything else, tent, sleeping bag, thousands of dollars in microphones and gear. He ran down the creek, splashing through water that made no sound, pursued by lights that bobbed silently behind him. He ran for hours, or what felt like hours. The hollow seemed longer than miles, the terrain different than what he'd hiked through earlier. Trees he didn't recognize, rock formations that hadn't been on the map. His GPS showed coordinates that made no sense, placing him miles from where he should have been. The lights followed, patient and persistent, maintaining a constant distance. Not gaining, but never falling behind either. Ethan's lungs burned, his legs felt like rubber, and he was on the verge of collapse when he burst through a line of trees and found himself on a road. An actual paved road with a yellow center line and reflective markers. Highway 39 according to a sign. Impossible. Highway 39 was 15 miles from Stillwater Hollow. But he was here somehow. He stood on the pavement, gasping for air, and looked back at the woods. The lights had stopped at the tree line. They hovered there, maybe a dozen of them, and Ethan could now see the figures carrying them more clearly. They were watching him, he realized. Not with eyes, they didn't have eyes or faces or any features he could discern. But they were aware of him, focused on him. One of them raised an arm, or what served as an arm, and pointed at him. Then they turned and disappeared back into the woods, the lights winking out one by one. A truck came around the corner and Ethan flagged it down. The driver was a local, heading home from a late shift at a sawmill in Richwood. He gave Ethan a ride to the nearest town, listening with obvious skepticism to a rambling story about getting lost and leaving equipment behind. Ethan tried to organize a retrieval expedition. He contacted the Park Service, explained he'd left valuable equipment at his campsite in Stillwater Hollow, needed help bringing it out. The ranger he spoke to was confused. "There's no Stillwater Hollow in Monongahela," the ranger said. "You sure about the name?" Ethan checked his maps, his GPS logs, his initial briefing documents. Stillwater Hollow was marked clearly on the Park Service maps they'd given him, but when he showed the maps to the ranger, the name wasn't there. The hollow existed, the drainage basin was visible, but it had a different name, Silent Run, and there was a notation next to it in small print, closed to public access. Research permits denied. Why is it closed? Ethan asked. The ranger shrugged. Before my time, I heard there were some accidents back in the 70s, some hikers that disappeared. Area's been off limits since then. You weren't supposed to go in there. Ethan never retrieved his equipment. He filed an insurance claim, took the loss, and tried to forget about what happened in the hollow that swallows sound. But he couldn't forget. His entire career was sound, and what he'd experienced violated everything he knew about acoustics, about physics, about how the natural world worked. He did research. He found references to Silent Run going back to the 1920s, mentions in old surveyors' reports and geological surveys. Several noted unusual acoustic properties or sound deadening effect. There were stories, unverified, anecdotal, about people who'd gone into that hollow and come out different, or hadn't come out at all. And he found something else. A reference in a university archive to a recording made in 1967 by a researcher named Dr. Patricia Kemper, who'd been studying acoustic anomalies in Appalachian valleys. She'd gone to Silent Run with recording equipment and come out with 3 hours of tape. But the tapes were blank, not erased, but as if they'd never recorded anything at all, despite her field notes insisting she'd captured sounds the entire time. Dr. Kemper's notes, scanned and preserved in the archive, included a final entry. Sound doesn't exist in that place the way it exists elsewhere. It's absorbed, consumed by something. I could see things making sound, water flowing, trees falling, animals moving, but my equipment recorded silence. As if the very nature of sound itself is different there, incompatible with the rest of the world. I recommend the area be closed permanently to research. Whatever is in that hollow, it doesn't follow natural laws, and I fear what might happen if someone stays too long, if sound itself becomes unlearned, forgot. Could a human exist in a place where sound doesn't? Would they forget how to speak, how to hear, how to exist in our acoustic reality? I don't want to know the answer. The research site was closed 3 months after Dr. Kemper's visit. Ethan is 52 now, still working, still recording natural soundscapes. But he tests every location first, makes sure his equipment captures sound normally before setting up for serious work. And he avoids West Virginia entirely, won't take contracts there regardless of pay. Sometimes, though, he reviews his GPS logs from that day in Silent Run, the coordinates that made no sense, the path that seemed to change as he ran. And he notices something he'd missed in his panic to escape. His equipment was recording the entire time he was running. 3 hours of audio captured while he fled through the hollow. He's never listened to it. The file sits on his hard drive, backed up, preserved, but unopened. Because Ethan knows recording. 3 hours of silence, maybe his own breathing and footsteps, nothing else. But the file size is wrong. It's too large, as if it contains more audio data than silence would require. Something was making sound in that hollow while he ran. Something his conscious mind couldn't process or remember, but his equipment captured. And Ethan has decided he doesn't want to know what it was, doesn't want to hear what exists in a place where sound goes to die. The file is labeled Silent Run Final, WAV, and it will stay closed, unlistened to, a digital tomb for sounds that shouldn't exist, because some recordings aren't meant to be heard. Some sounds, Ethan has learned, are silent for a reason. Story 8. The Spring That Runs Backward. Catherine Walsh was a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey, specializing in karst topography, the limestone cave systems that riddled much of Kentucky and Tennessee. She'd spent 16 years mapping underground water systems, studying how surface water disappeared into sinkholes and emerged miles away from springs, tracing the hidden hydrology that existed beneath the Appalachian Plateau. In August 2011, at 39 years old, she was leading a research project in Carter Cave State Park in northeastern Kentucky, mapping a newly discovered connection between a sinkhole complex and a spring system. The work was technical and painstaking. Catherine and her team used dye tracers, harmless fluorescent compounds poured into sinkholes that could be detected when they emerged from springs, sometimes days later and miles away. By tracking these tracers, they could map the underground channels and understand how water moved through the limestone. On August 17th, Catherine's team poured rhodamine dye into a sinkhole designated as KYCC47, located in a remote section of the park about 3 miles from the nearest trail. The sinkhole was substantial, maybe 15 feet across, with water visibly disappearing into a hole at the bottom. Based on elevation and geological structure, Catherine predicted the water would emerge at one of 3 springs they'd identified downstream, probably within 48 to 72 hours. They placed automatic samplers at all 3 springs, devices that would collect water every 4 hours and test for the presence of rhodamine. Then they hiked back to their field station to wait. 48 hours later, none of the samplers showed rhodamine. Catherine wasn't concerned. Sometimes tracing took longer than predicted. Underground routes could be circuitous, taking unexpected paths through the limestone. 72 hours, still nothing. A week, no rhodamine at any of the predicted emergence points. Catherine was puzzled. The dye was persistent. It didn't degrade quickly. If the water from KYCC47 was emerging anywhere in the drainage basin, they should have detected it. She expanded the sampling area, placing devices at 6 additional springs. Nothing. 2 weeks after the initial dye injection, Catherine's field assistant, Marcus Chen, reported something strange. He'd been checking the sampler at the original sinkhole. They'd placed one there as a control to track how long the dye remained concentrated at the injection point. The sampler showed elevated rhodamine levels, not unusual in itself. Residual dye could linger in a sinkhole for weeks, but the concentration was increasing. That made no sense. Dye concentration at the source should decrease over time as water flushed the system, but the readings showed levels rising steadily, as if more dye was appearing instead of less. Catherine hiked out to KYCC47 with Marcus and her other assistant, Lee Sutton. They brought fresh testing equipment, thinking there must be a malfunction with the automatic sampler. When they arrived at the sinkhole, Catherine took manual samples of the water pooling at the bottom. The rhodamine concentration was extremely high, higher than what they'd poured in 2 weeks earlier, as if the dye was accumulating instead of dispersing. "Did someone else pour dye here?" Lee asked. "Another research team," Catherine shook her head. "We're the only active project in this area. And they'd have to be using the exact same dye, the exact same concentration. The odds of that," she trailed off, watching the water in the sinkhole. It was moving, swirling in a slow eddy, and the rhodamine made the flow visible, bright pink threads spiraling in the clear water. Catherine studied the pattern for a moment, trying to understand what she was seeing. The water was flowing backward, not bubbling up as if from a spring. That would create a different pattern. This was water flowing upstream against gravity, spiraling inward toward the center of the sinkhole instead of draining out. Catherine dropped a leaf into the water. It floated for a moment, then began moving in a spiral pattern, slowly at first, then faster, pulled toward the center of the sinkhole. When it reached the middle, it disappeared, sucked down into the hole. But the water level in the sinkhole didn't drop. If water was draining, the level should decrease. Instead, it remained constant, which meant water was coming at the rate it was leaving. Coming in from where? Catherine set up a more sophisticated experiment. She placed a flow meter in the sinkhole, anchored it to bedrock, and monitored it for 6 hours. The data was impossible. Water was flowing into the sinkhole from below, from the drainage hole that should have been carrying water down into the limestone. The direction of flow had reversed. Water was coming up from underground carrying rhodamine dye with it, the same dye they'd poured in 2 weeks earlier. Some kind of hydrostatic pressure, Marcus suggested. Maybe there's a blockage downstream forcing water back up, Catherine considered it. In karst systems, blockages could create temporary reversals in flow direction, with water backing up until it found an alternate route. But this didn't feel like a temporary blockage. The flow was steady, consistent, and the rhodamine concentration suggested all the dye they'd injected was coming back. "We need to see where this goes," Catherine said. "We need to get underground." Cave diving in karst systems was dangerous, and Catherine wasn't certified for technical diving. But there was an entrance to the cave system about a mile away, accessible without diving gear. The Carter Cave's main system had been mapped extensively, and Catherine knew there were passages that went near where KYCC-47 should connect underground. They got permission from park management, gathered caving equipment, and descended into the main cave system the next morning. Catherine led, with Marcus and Lee following, their helmet lamps cutting through absolute darkness. They followed mapped passages for about 40 minutes, going deeper into the limestone, until they reached an area where Catherine's survey data suggested they were close to the KYCC-47 sinkhole's drainage route. They found a side passage, tight and unmapped, with water flowing through it. Following standard cave safety protocols, Catherine marked their route with reflective tape, and they squeezed through the narrow opening. The passage opened into a chamber about 30 feet across, and that's where things stopped making sense. The water was flowing uphill, not bubbling up from a spring. Catherine had seen plenty of those. This was stream water, moving in a channel carved into the cave floor, flowing up a visible slope in defiance of gravity. Catherine could see the water level tilted, higher on the uphill side, water climbing over rocks and flowing up a gradient that should have been impossible. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, his voice echoing in the chamber. Catherine approached the stream, knelt down, and put her hand in the water. It was cold, normal limestone cave water, about 54 degrees, but it was flowing upward, and when she released a few grains of sand into the current, they floated upstream, climbing the slope. "Check the compass," Catherine said. Lee pulled out her compass and held it steady. The needle spun lazily, unable to find north, moving in slow circles without settling on any direction. "Magnetic anomaly," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice professional, scientific. "There's something down here affecting the magnetic field." "Something that makes water flow uphill?" Marcus asked, his skepticism clear. Catherine didn't have an answer. She followed the impossible stream up the slope, which should have been down the slope, her team trailing behind. The passage continued for maybe 200 feet, gradually ascending or descending, depending on whether you trusted your eyes or gravity. The water's rhodamine concentration grew stronger, the pink color now visible without any testing equipment. The passage ended at a wall. Not a natural cave wall. This was too smooth, too regular. It looked carved, deliberately shaped by tools. And in the center of the wall was an opening, maybe 4 feet wide, perfectly circular. The water flowed from this opening, spilling down, or up, into the passage where Catherine and her team stood. Catherine shined her light into the opening. It was a tunnel extending beyond the range of her lamp, the walls showing the same carved regularity as the entrance. And something was wrong with the perspective. The tunnel should have looked smaller at the far end, vanishing to a point according to normal geometry. Instead, it looked larger, as if it was expanding the further it went. "We should go back," Lee said, her voice tight with stress. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Catherine knew Lee was correct. Every instinct, every bit of training said to retreat, mark the location, and bring in specialists. But scientific curiosity warred with caution, and curiosity was winning. She'd been studying karst hydrology for 16 years, and this was something entirely new, something that didn't fit any model or theory she knew. 10 minutes, Catherine said. We go in for 10 minutes, see what's there, then we retreat and report. She entered the tunnel before anyone could argue, crawling through the circular opening, her team reluctantly following. The carved tunnel continued for about 30 feet, then opened into another chamber. Catherine emerged into a space that shouldn't exist. The chamber was enormous, at least 100 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond her range. But it wasn't the size that stopped her cold, it was the structure in the center. A spring, but not a natural spring. This was constructed, built from stones that looked ancient, fitted together with precision that suggested advanced engineering. Water flowed from the center of the structure, but the flow was all wrong. The water rose up, arcing through the air like a fountain, but instead of falling back down, it flowed upward, curving toward the ceiling where it disappeared into darkness. And around the spring, carved into the stone floor, were symbols. Not random markings. These were deliberate, repeating patterns that looked almost like writing, but in no language Catherine recognized. "Professor," Marcus said, his voice shaking, "look at the ceiling." Catherine directed her lamp upward and saw the water. It was flowing across the ceiling, running in channels carved into the stone, moving in patterns that defied every law of physics she knew. And it wasn't just flowing, it was glowing. The rhodamine dye concentrated enough to be luminescent, creating rivers of pink light across the darkness overhead. "We need to leave," Catherine said, her scientific curiosity finally overcome by pure primal fear. "We need to leave now." They retreated, crawling back through the tunnel, scrambling down the passage where water flowed uphill, returning to the mapped sections of the cave system. They didn't speak during the climb out, didn't discuss what they'd seen until they were above ground, in sunlight, surrounded by the normal physics of the surface world. Catherine reported the discovery to her supervisor at USGS, describing what they'd found in technical terms: unexplained hydrological anomaly, possible magnetic disturbance, constructed chamber of unknown age and origin. Her supervisor listened, asked pointed questions, and told her the site would be investigated further. 2 weeks later, Catherine received notice that the area around KYCC 47 was being closed to research pending a geological stability survey. Access was restricted, her team's permits were revoked, and the project was officially terminated. Catherine tried to push back, arguing that they'd made a significant discovery that warranted serious study. Her supervisor was sympathetic but firm. "The decision came from above me, way above me. The site is closed. The data you collected is being classified for national security review. I know it doesn't make sense, but those are the orders." National security. For a cave with weird water flow. Catherine didn't understand until she did more research. References to other sites in Appalachia with similar anomalies, places where physics seemed to work differently, where water flowed wrong, where compasses spun uselessly. Most of these references were old, from the 1800s and early 1900s, before such things were officially dismissed as folklore or measurement error. But they weren't folklore. They were real. And someone in the government knew about them, had known for a long time, and was actively suppressing information about them. Catherine tried to access her own research data and found it had been removed from USGS servers. Her field notes, her water samples, even her photographs, all classified and removed. Officially, her project had ended due to budget constraints with no significant findings. She quit USGS in 2012 and took a position at a private environmental consulting firm where she works on groundwater contamination cases. Safe, normal work that doesn't involve impossible chambers or water that flows uphill. But she thinks about that spring, about the symbols carved around it and the water flowing across the ceiling in defiance of gravity. She's developed a theory, One she can't prove and doesn't discuss except after too many drinks with friends who think she's joking. The theory is this: the Appalachian Mountains are old, ancient. They were tall mountains when the Rockies were just starting to rise, and they've been worn down by hundreds of millions of years of erosion. And in all that time, in all those countless years, maybe other things were here. Other people, or beings, or civilizations that understood physics differently than we do, that could build structures that worked according to rules we've forgotten or never knew. And maybe those structures are still there, hidden in caves and hollows, still functioning according to their original design, creating pockets where water flows uphill and rhodamine dye returns to its source, and the normal laws that govern the world outside don't apply. Catherine is 48 now, and she hasn't been caving since 2011. She tells people she's gotten too old for crawling through tight passages, that she prefers desk work these days. But the truth is, she's afraid of what else might be down there, what other impossible things might exist in the darkness beneath these old mountains. And sometimes she wonders about the water flowing upward in that hidden chamber, wonders where it goes when it reaches the ceiling, where those channels carved in the rock above lead, up into the mountain, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere that follows different rules. Springs run backward and time flows in directions humans can't perceive. She doesn't know. She'll never know. The site is closed, the data classified, the discovery officially unmade. But the water is still there, still flowing impossible through carved channels in the dark, still carrying rhodamine dye back to its source, forever returning, never reaching any destination, trapped in a loop that might be spatial or might be temporal or might be something for which human language has no words at all. Story 9. The cabin that wasn't there yesterday. Trevor Hutchins had been a backcountry ranger for the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee for 7 years when he discovered something that made him question his understanding of how reality worked. At 33, he was young for the position, but he'd proven himself capable during his first seasons. He knew the trails, could handle medical emergencies, and wasn't afraid of the solitude that came with week-long patrols through remote sections of the forest. In September 2018, Trevor was on a standard patrol of the Big Frog Wilderness area, a 8,055-acre roadless section of the forest known for its rugged terrain and old-growth forest. He'd hiked this particular loop, a 3-day circuit covering about 28 miles, at least 15 times over the years. He knew every landmark, every creek crossing, every camping spot. On day 2 of his patrol, hiking through a section of forest about 2 miles from the Big Frog Mountain summit, Trevor saw a cabin. This shouldn't have been remarkable except for one crucial fact. There had never been a cabin in this location before. Trevor had passed this exact spot, a small clearing near a creek, dozens of times. It had always been empty, but now there was a cabin, not a new cabin either. This structure looked old, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, a shake shingle roof covered in moss. It looked like it had been standing for 50 or 60 years at least, weathered and settled into the landscape. Trevor stopped on the trail, studying the cabin from a distance of about 100 feet. He pulled out his GPS and confirmed his location. Yes, this was the clearing he thought it was. He'd taken his lunch break in this exact spot just 3 months earlier in June, and there had been no cabin. Just an empty clearing with some old foundation stones that he'd always assumed were from a settler's cabin that had rotted away decades ago. But now the cabin was here, fully intact, looking like it had always been here. His thought was that he'd gotten turned around, that this was a different clearing with a different cabin. But his GPS didn't lie, and he knew these trails too well to have made that kind of mistake. This was the right location, and this cabin had not existed 3 months ago. His second thought was that someone had built it recently, though that made no sense. Building in wilderness areas was illegal, and constructing a cabin this size would have required hauling in materials, running power tools, creating disturbance that Trevor would have noticed on his regular patrols. Plus, the cabin looked old, not new. The moss on the roof didn't grow overnight. Ranger protocols were clear about investigating structures in the wilderness. Trevor approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was present. No response. The cabin sat silent in the clearing, smoke rising from the chimney. Wait, smoke. Trevor stopped. Yes, smoke was definitely coming from the chimney, a thin stream rising straight up in the still air. Someone was inside, had a fire going. Trevor called out again, louder this time. Forest Service. Anyone home? Still no response. Trevor approached the cabin's door, a simple plank door with leather hinges, no lock. He knocked, announced himself again, and when there was still no answer, he tried the latch. The door opened. The interior was dim, lit only by what light came through one small window and the glow from a fire in the fireplace. The cabin was a single room, maybe 20 feet square, with a dirt floor and minimal furniture. A rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a straw mattress. Shelves on one wall held basic supplies, jars of preserved food, a few tools, some folded cloth, and everything looked old. Not antique store old, but genuinely aged. The tools were worn from use, the jars had sediment and dust, the cloth was faded and stained. This wasn't someone's weekend retreat or a historical recreation. This was a cabin that had been lived in, really lived in for years. But it hadn't existed 3 months ago. Trevor stood in the doorway, his mind trying to process this. The fire in the fireplace was real. He could feel the heat, see the logs burning down to coals. Someone had been here recently, was still here, maybe hiding or watching. He backed out of the cabin, deeply unsettled, and did a thorough search of the clearing and surrounding woods. He found no one, no signs of recent travel on the trails, no footprints except his own. But there were other signs of habitation, a garden plot with beans and squash growing, a woodpile with recently split logs, up down to the creek. Trevor took photographs, documented everything he could, and hiked back to the ranger station at a faster pace than normal. He reported the cabin to his supervisor, showing the GPS coordinates and photos. His supervisor, Dale Morrison, looked at the photos with a frown. Where'd you say this was? Big Frog Wilderness, about 2 miles southwest of the summit. Here are the coordinates. Dale pulled up a map on his computer, checking the location. Trevor, there's no cabin there. I've patrolled that area. It's empty. It wasn't empty yesterday. I'm telling you, Dale, this cabin is there. I went inside. Someone's living in it. Dale studied the photos more carefully. These look authentic. I mean, if someone was going to build an illegal cabin, it wouldn't look like this. This looks historical. He pulled up some records, checking historical surveys of the area. There was a homestead near there, actually. The Mackey place occupied from around 1880 to 1933, but the cabin burned down in 34. There's documentation. The Forest Service did a survey after acquiring the land, noted the burned foundation. Well, it's not burned now, Trevor said. It's there and it's occupied, and I need to know what to do about it. Dale decided they'd go back together the next day with additional rangers and hopefully some answers. Trevor led a team of 4 back to the location, following his GPS track from the previous day. The clearing was empty. No cabin. Just the clearing, the foundation stones that had always been there, and forest growing where the structure had stood. Trevor walked to the exact spot where he'd photographed the door. Nothing. He checked his GPS. They were in the right place. It was here, Trevor insisted. Right here. I have photographs. I have. We believe you, Dale said carefully. The photos are clearly real, but it's not here now. Maybe you've got the coordinates wrong. Maybe there's another clearing nearby. They searched for 3 hours, checking every clearing within a mile. Nothing. No cabin, no garden, no woodpile. Nothing that matched Trevor's photos and description. The team hiked out, and Trevor could feel their skepticism, could see them exchanging glances when they thought he wasn't looking. They thought he'd hallucinated or gotten confused or was playing some kind of prank. Trevor went back alone 2 days later. The clearing was still empty. But when he examined the foundation stones more carefully, he found something new, a stone with a date carved into it, 1887, and below that a name, E. Mackey. Elijah Mackey had been the homesteader, according to Forest Service records. He'd lived in the cabin with his wife and 3 till his death in 1933. The cabin had burned a year later under mysterious circumstances. Trevor started researching. He found references to Elijah Mackey in local historical societies, mentions in census records and land deeds. And he found something else, stories about the Mackey place, whispered accounts from the 1920s and 30s about strange occurrences. People would report seeing the cabin lit up at night when it was supposed to be abandoned. Travelers claimed to have stopped there and been given food and shelter, only to return later and find no cabin, just foundation stones. After the fire in 1934, the stories continued. Hikers occasionally reported seeing a cabin in that clearing, smoke coming from the chimney, signs of recent habitation. But whenever anyone investigated officially, the clearing was empty. Trevor found a newspaper article from 1962 about a Boy Scout troop that had gotten lost in the area. 2 of the scouts claimed they'd spent a night in a cabin near Big Frog Mountain, said an old man had given them shelter and food. When the troop leader investigated the next day, there was no cabin. The boys were reprimanded for lying, though they insisted the cabin was real. The pattern was clear. The cabin appeared and disappeared, had been doing so for at least 80 years, maybe longer. And when it appeared, it seemed real, solid, occupied, functional. Not a ghost or a vision, but an actual physical structure that existed temporarily before vanishing again. Trevor became obsessed. He hiked to that clearing every week, sometimes multiple times a week, hoping to see the cabin again. Other rangers started to worry about him, suggesting he take some time off, maybe talk to a counselor, but Trevor couldn't let it go. In November 2018, 3 months after his first sighting, he saw it again. Same cabin, same smoke from the chimney. This time Trevor didn't approach. He sat in the woods about 50 yards away and watched through binoculars. For 4 hours, he observed the cabin without moving closer. And during that time, he saw things that convinced him this wasn't just a random structure appearing and disappearing. The cabin had windows, and through those windows, Trevor could see movement. Shadows, shapes that moved like people going about daily tasks. At one point, smoke from the chimney increased as if someone had added wood to the fire. Later, the door opened and Trevor saw a figure emerge, a man, though Trevor couldn't make out details at this distance. The man walked to the woodpile, gathered an armload, and returned inside. Trevor took video with his phone, capturing everything he could. Then, as the sun began to set, he noticed something strange. The cabin was becoming translucent. The edges were blurring, becoming less distinct. Over the course of maybe 15 minutes, the structure faded like a photograph left in sunlight, growing paler and less substantial until it was gone. Trevor walked to the clearing immediately. It was empty. The ground where the cabin had stood showed no sign of disturbance. No footprints, no ash from the chimney, nothing. But Trevor had it on video, clear footage of a solid structure that had then faded from existence. He showed the video to Dale, who watched it 3 times without speaking. Finally, Dale said, "Don't show this to anyone else. Don't post it online, don't send it to the media. This stays between us." "Why? This is incredible. This is proof of something." "Of what? What would you call this? A ghost cabin? A time slip? Whatever it is, it's beyond what we're equipped to handle. And if you make this public, you'll have every paranormal investigator, every internet conspiracy theorist, Dale paused, collected himself. "Trevor, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've seen things in these mountains I can't explain. Most rangers have, if they're honest. We don't talk about it because talking about it doesn't help. It just makes people think you're crazy. So what? We just ignore it. No, we note it, we respect it, and we leave it alone. The mountains are old, Trevor. Older than us, older than our understanding. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Trevor didn't agree, but he kept the video private. He continued his patrols, continued checking the clearing. Over the following year, he saw the cabin 3 more times, always appearing and disappearing in the same pattern. And he started noticing other things in the Big Frog wilderness. Trails that were there one day and gone the next, rock formations that seemed to shift position, sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal. In 2020, Trevor quit the Forest Service. He told people he wanted to pursue other opportunities, but the truth was that the mountains had shown him too much, had revealed that the world was stranger and more fluid than he'd believed, and he couldn't continue working in a system that required him to pretend otherwise. He's 38 now, working as an outdoor guide in Colorado, far from the ancient Appalachians. But he thinks about the cabin often, wonders who or what lives there in those brief windows when it exists. Is it Elijah Mackey, somehow still inhabiting a street earned 90 years ago, living in moments stolen from time? Or is it something else, some echo or recording of the past playing out over and over? Trevor has a theory, one he keeps to himself. He thinks the cabin exists in its own time, its own bubble of reality where it's always 1920 or 1910 or whatever year it truly is. And occasionally that bubble intersects with the present, becomes visible and solid to people in the current timeline. For a few hours or a day, the past and present occupy the same space, and if you're there at the right moment, you can see it, touch it, even enter it. But the bubbles don't stay aligned. Time flows differently there in that cabin's reality, and eventually the divergence becomes too great. The present moves on, the bubble separates, and the cabin returns to whenever it truly exists, invisible to people living in 2018 or 2024 or any other year that's not its own. It's not a scientific theory. It's not even a particularly coherent theory. But it's the only explanation Trevor has found that makes sense of what he saw. A cabin that's real but not present, occupied but abandoned. There, and not there in the same clearing where foundation stones mark where it used to stand. And sometimes Trevor wonders if the reverse is true, if there are places from the present that occasionally bleed through into the past. If Elijah Mackey, going about his day in 1920, ever looked out his window and saw ghosts, people in strange clothes with incomprehensible devices, hiking past his home on trails that don't exist in his time, living in a future he can glimpse but never touch. Time and space aren't as fixed as we believe, Trevor has learned. In these old mountains, where human history stacks layer upon layer going back thousands of years, sometimes those layers press against each other, thin enough to see through, thin enough to walk through for brief moments before snapping back into their proper sequence. The cabin is still there, Trevor knows. Still existing, still occupied, still real. Just not in this moment, not in this particular slice of time. But wait long enough, be patient enough, and the moment will come when past and present align again. And for a few precious hours, you can step into a world that shouldn't exist and meet people who have been dead for 90 years but don't know it yet. Story 10. The Thing That Climbs at Night. Rebecca Forrester had inherited her grandmother's house in Watauga County, North Carolina. The specific condition that she live in it for at least 1 full year before selling. At 28, recently divorced and working remotely as a graphic designer, Rebecca had nothing keeping her in Atlanta and decided to honor her grandmother's wishes. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen, and living room, built in 1947 on 5 acres of mountain land, isolated enough that the nearest neighbor was half a mile away through dense woods. Rebecca moved in on October 1st, 2019, with her cat, her computer equipment, and not much else. The house had been maintained by her grandmother until her death in July, so it was in good condition if dated. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the floors were wide plank heart pine, and the whole place smelled like the cedar sachets her grandmother had kept in every closet and drawer. The first few weeks were peaceful. Rebecca worked during the day, took walks in the surrounding woods, and enjoyed the solitude after years of city living. She noticed the house made sounds at night. Old houses always did, but nothing alarming. Settling, expanding, contracting with temperature changes. Normal structural sounds. Then 3 weeks after moving in, Rebecca woke at 2:30 in the morning to a sound that wasn't normal at all. Scratching. Deliberate and rhythmic, coming from outside. From the wall specifically. Rebecca's bedroom was on the first floor, and the sound seemed to be coming from the exterior wall, about halfway up. As if something was climbing the side of the house, its claws or hands gripping the wooden siding. Rebecca lay still, listening. The scratching moved slowly upward, accompanied by soft impacts. Thump, scratch, something pulling itself up the wall. It reached the roof line, moved across the roof, and then stopped. Silence for about 30 seconds. Then the scratching started again, this time from a different wall. Whatever it was had moved around the roof and was now climbing down the opposite side of the house. Rebecca got up, grabbed her phone as a flashlight, and went to the window. She pulled back the curtain and looked out into the yard, illuminated by a half moon. Nothing. No animals, no movement. The scratching had stopped. She went back to bed, telling herself it was a raccoon or a possum. Mountain houses got all kinds of wildlife on the roof: squirrels, birds, small mammals looking for warmth or food. But the next night it happened again. Same time, 2:30 a.m. Scratching, climbing sounds, moving up one side of the house, across the roof, down the other side. And this time Rebecca noticed something else. The sound was too heavy for a raccoon. The impact suggested something larger, heavier. Bear-sized maybe. But bears didn't climb houses, not like this. The pattern continued nightly. 2:30 a.m., scratching starts, something climbs the exterior walls, moves across the roof, descends. Sometimes it circled the entire house. Other nights it only climbed partway before descending again. But it was always there, always at the same time. Rebecca set up her phone to record audio one night, placing it on the windowsill to capture whatever was making the sounds. In the morning, she reviewed the recording and heard the scratching clearly, loud enough that it couldn't be mistaken for settling or wind. She also heard something else: breathing. Deep, slow breaths that accompanied the climbing sounds. She mentioned it to her neighbor, Earl Hastings, a man in his 60s who'd lived in the area his whole life. Earl listened to her description and his expression grew serious. "Your grandmother ever mention anything climbing around at night?" he asked. "No, she never said anything about that." Earl nodded slowly. "She wouldn't have. Your grandmother was. Well, she handled things her own way. Didn't talk about them much." He paused, seemed to be deciding how much to say. "That house has had something climbing it for as long as I can remember. My father mentioned it too, said it had been doing it since before he was born. Your grandmother knew about it, she just never let it bother her." "What is it? A bear? Some kind of animal?" "Might be an animal," Earl said carefully. "Might not be. Nobody's ever gotten a good look at it. It only comes at night and it's smart, knows when people are watching. Your grandmother, she told me once that the best thing to do was ignore it. Don't go outside when it's climbing, don't try to photograph it, don't shine lights at it. Just let it do its business and it'll leave you alone." Rebecca was skeptical. "That's it. Just ignore some giant animal climbing my house every night. It's been doing it for at least 80 years without hurting anyone or causing damage. I'd say that's a pretty good reason to leave it be." But Rebecca couldn't leave it be. The sound kept her awake, filled her with a dread that was hard to articulate. It wasn't just an animal. She was certain of that. Animals didn't climb with such deliberate rhythm, didn't breathe in that measured way, didn't move around a house like they were inspecting it. She set up a trail camera, the kind hunters used to photograph wildlife. She mounted it on a tree aimed at the side of the house where the climbing usually started. The camera was motion activated with night vision, capable of capturing clear images in complete darkness. The next morning, Rebecca checked the camera. It had tricked times during the night. She loaded the SD card into her computer, eager to finally see what had been climbing her house. The first few frames showed nothing unusual, the side of the house, illuminated by infrared, empty and still. Then motion. Something entering the frame from the bottom, moving up the wall. Rebecca couldn't process what she was seeing. The thing climbing her house wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal she recognized. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the body too narrow. And it moved wrong, its joints bending at angles that shouldn't be possible, its fingers or claws gripping the siding with strength that seemed to press into the wood. The camera had captured maybe 10 frames total as the thing climbed past the camera's field of view. Rebecca went through them one by one, zooming in, trying to see details. The thing's skin, if it was skin, looked rough, dark, maybe furred or maybe scaled. Its head was shaped wrong, elongated with what might have been a snout or might have been something else. But the worst part was one particular frame, captured as the thing reached the roofline. It had turned its head toward the camera. Toward Rebecca's bedroom window, actually, but it had looked directly at the camera in the process. And its eyes reflected the infrared light, glowing white in the image, too large and too far apart to be human. Rebecca deleted the images immediately, her hands shaking. Then she retrieved them from the trash, unable to let go of the only evidence she had. Then she deleted them again, permanently this time, removing them from the SD card in her computer. She didn't know what she'd seen, but she knew with absolute certainty that she didn't want to see it again. That night, 2:30 a.m., the scratching started as usual. Rebecca lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the thing climb her house. It moved up the wall, across the roof, and then, for the first time since she'd moved in, it stopped directly above her bedroom. She heard it up there, moving around, its weight making the rafters creak. Then scratching sounds directly overhead. Not climbing, digging. It was scratching at the roof, testing the shingles, pressing against them. Rebecca's cat, who'd been sleeping on the bed, suddenly bolted from the room, its ears flat, tail puffed. Rebecca wanted to run too, but she was frozen, staring at the ceiling, listening to the thing above her test the integrity of the roof. After what felt like hours but was probably 5 minutes, the scratching stopped. The thing moved away, climbed down the far side of the house, and was gone. Rebecca didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, she went and checked the roof. There were marks in the shingles above her bedroom, deep scratches, 4 parallel grooves that had scraped away the asphalt coating and exposed the underlayment. Whatever had made those marks had claws or talons strong enough to rip through roofing material. Rebecca called Earl. He came over, looked at the marks, and sighed. "You set up a camera, didn't you? Tried to see it." "How did you?" "Because it knows. It always knows." "Your grandmother told me that too. Said it didn't like being watched, didn't like people trying to see it. Most nights it just climbs, does its rounds, leaves. But if you pay too much attention, if you try to capture it, it gets curious, tests boundaries." "What is it?" Rebecca demanded. "Stop being cryptic and just tell me what the hell is climbing my house every night." Earl looked uncomfortable. "Nobody knows exactly. The old folks, and I mean real old, people from back in the 1800s, they had stories about things that lived in these mountains before people settled here. Things that didn't leave when we built our houses and cleared our land. They just adapted, found ways to live alongside us as long as we respected their territory and didn't bother them too much. That's folklore. That's not a real answer. Maybe, but I'll tell you this. There's dozens of houses in these mountains that have similar stories. Things that climb at night, things that knock on walls, things that walk across roofs. Different things in different places, but all with the same pattern. They've been doing it for generations, and the folks who try to fight it or document it or drive it away, they don't do well. But the folks who accept it, who live with it peacefully, they're fine. Your grandmother lived in this house for 70 years, died in her sleep at 94. Whatever's climbing at night, it never hurt her. Rebecca wanted to argue, wanted to demand evidence and explanations, but Earl's expression made it clear he'd said all he was going to say. For the next 3 weeks, Rebecca lived with the nightly climbing. She didn't set up more cameras, didn't try to photograph it, didn't even look out the windows when the scratching started. She followed her grandmother's apparent philosophy: ignore it and it would ignore her. And it seemed to work. The thing kept climbing, but it stopped testing her roof. It returned to its pattern: up one side, across, down the other side. A circuit around the house, like a guard making rounds or an animal marking territory. Rebecca completed her 1-year obligation in October 2020 and immediately put the house on the market. She didn't mention the nighttime visitor to potential buyers. That felt dishonest, but she also knew no one would believe her. The house sold in 3 weeks to a couple from Florida looking for a mate. Rebecca wonders sometimes if they've noticed the climbing, if they lie awake at 2:30 a.m. listening to something massive pulling itself up their walls, if they've tried to photograph it, and if so, what happened when they did. She's 33 now, living in Asheville in a modern apartment complex surrounded by other buildings and people. No scratching at night, no climbing sounds, no massive talons testing her roof. But sometimes, especially in October when the anniversary of her year in that house comes around, she dreams about it. In the dreams, she's back in her grandmother's bedroom and the scratching starts. But this time, instead of climbing the outside, the thing comes inside. It moves through the house with that same deliberate rhythm, pulling itself along the walls and ceiling, and Rebecca is paralyzed, unable to move as it searches room by room, looking for her. Curious about the person who tried to see it, who broke the unspoken agreement by setting up cameras and demanding answers. She wakes from these dreams in a sweat and tells herself they're just nightmares, just her mind processing trauma. But she knows the thing is real. She has the trail camera still, stored in a closet, and sometimes she's tempted to check if any images remain on it, if something survived her deletion attempts. She never looks. Because Earl was right about one thing, some questions are better left unanswered. Some things in these old mountains have been here longer than human memory, and they'll be here long after humans are gone. And the agreement between us and them is simple. We pretend not to see them, and they pretend not to see us. Break that agreement, pay too much attention, and you become interesting to things that should never find humans interesting. The house still stands. Rebecca drives past it sometimes when she visits other parts of Watauga County. The new owners have made improvements: fresh paint, new landscaping, solar panels on the roof. She wonders if the thing minds the changes, or if it just adapts, climbing around the solar panels, adjusting its route to accommodate human modifications to its territory. And she wonders if somewhere in those mountains, there are dozens or hundreds of other houses with similar arrangements. Other things that climb or knock or walk, performing their nightly rituals while the humans inside pretend to sleep, both parties maintaining the fiction that the other doesn't exist. A whole hidden ecology of ancient beings and modern people, coexisting in careful ignorance, knowing that the day the pretense ends is the day everything changes. Want to be there when that day comes. She's seen enough, knows enough. Let the thing climb its nightly circuit. Let it mark its territory and patrol its boundaries. As long as it stays outside and she stays inside, the arrangement works. Some doors are better left closed, some questions better left unasked, and some sounds in the night are better ignored, no matter how loud the scratching gets or how much you want to know what's making it. Because once you see it, really see it, you can't unsee it, and it can't unsee you either. And that mutual acknowledgement changes everything, breaks the spell that keeps the old world and the new world from colliding. Rebecca learned that lesson. She hopes the new owners learn it too, before they get too curious, before they set up cameras or shine spotlights or do any of the thousand things humans do when confronted with mystery. But she suspects they won't. Humans rarely do. We're curious by nature, driven to explain and document and understand. And maybe that's why the things in the mountains have outlasted us, why they'll still be climbing and knocking and walking long after our houses crumble and our forests reclaim the land. Because they understand something we forgot. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious, and survival sometimes means knowing when to close your eyes and pretend you saw nothing at all.